The silence didn't last. It couldn't. We had just ripped the night apart. Damien, with a sound that resonated in the marrow of every living thing within 5 miles, and me with enough raw summer fire to turn the mud beneath our feet into steaming obsidian glass. For a heartbeat, the garrison at the main gate just stared, unified in their abject terror. They looked at the blind alpha who was suddenly staring back at them with the predator's clarity of a nuke coming online, and the unassuming slave woman glowing like a captured star caught in a bear trap. The air between us hummed with ozone and the sickeningly sweet scent of burned ozone and imminent violence. Marcus broke the spell. From his perch on the high wall, safe above the fray, on his sweating warhorse, his voice cracked with panic disguised as command. "Kill them! They're alone! Tear them apart before the witch casts again!" The order hit the pack like a physical whip crack. Instinct overrode fear. The mob psychology of the wolf took over, and the sea of fur, leather armor, and bared teeth surged forward, pouring through the gate and over the walls like a dark, furry tide. Damien didn't wait to be overwhelmed. He roared again, a shorter, sharper sound this time, less declaration and more detonation, and met the wave head on. It was terrifying to watch. He was a creature of pure kinetic tragedy, 20 years of sensory deprivation exploding into violence. He wasn't fighting with the refined technique of the training rings. He was fighting with cataclysmic need. He was seeing the world for the first time in decades, and his first act was to paint it red. He hit the front line like a runaway train. He caught the first wolf, a hulking brute in studded leather, by the snout and lower jaw, wrenching them apart with a sickening wet crunch that was audible over the howling. He didn't stop moving. He used the dying wolf as a battering ram to stagger the 3 behind him, then discarded the body and buried his claws into the chest of the next attacker, ripping outward with savage joy. Blood sprayed in high arcs, sizzling where it hit the superheated ground around my feet. I wasn't idle. I couldn't afford to be. Damien was a force of nature, but he was fighting blind in a new way, overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught of visual input. I saw him flinch violently at the flare of a torch reflecting off a steel breastplate, momentary confusion that nearly cost him an arm as a wolf clamped down. He roared in pain, shaking the attacker loose, but he was too slow to stop the flanker coming in low on his left. I didn't think. I just reacted. The magic was singing in my veins, desperate to be let out. I thrust my left hand forward, fingers splayed. A spear of concentrated sunlight, hot enough to vaporize flesh, impaled the flanking wolf midair. He didn't even scream. He just turned into ash and charred bone, crumbling before he hit the filthy ground. "Eyes up, wolf!" I screamed, my voice sounding strange and doubled in my own ears, layered with the harmonics of the Fae. I threw up a shimmering barrier of hardened air with my right hand, deflecting a hail of crossbow bolts fired from the ramparts. They clattered uselessly against the shield, sparking as they hit the magical density, but the effort made my teeth ache. The magic was a roaring river, but even rivers run dry, and I was burning through my reserves at a terrifying rate just to keep the swarm off him. We were killing them by the dozen. The narrow entryway to the slums was turning into an abattoir. The smell was atrocious. Copper, shit, burned fur, and the overwhelming, pungent musk of alpha aggression. But for every wolf Damien gutted, for everyone I incinerated, 2 more scrambled over the twitching corpses of their kin, driven by Marcus's frantic shouting from above. A massive black wolf broke through my perimeter, ignoring the searing heat of my aura. He lunged for my throat. I didn't have time to blast him. I dropped low, pulling a jagged iron dagger from my boot, a human weapon, grounding and nasty. As his jaws snapped where my neck had just been, I drove the blade upward, under his jaw, punching through bone into the brain. Hot blood bathed my hand, instantly cooling against the fire of my skin. I shoved the heavy body away, panting. We were losing. It wasn't a lack of power, it was simple arithmetic. We were 2 points of light drowning in a sea of darkness. If we stayed in this kill box, bottled up between the indestructible stone walls of the estate and the endless supply of Marcus's meat shields, we were finished. They would grind us down until I burned out and Damien was buried under sheer weight of numbers. I looked over at Damien. He was unrecognizable, covered in gore from muzzle to hip, his chest heaving like a bellows, his milky eyes wide and frantic as he tried to process the carnage he was creating. He was lost in the red haze, a berserker drowning in the blood he was spilling. He was incredible, and he was about to get us both killed. "Damien!" I bellowed, channeling a fraction of magic into my voice to cut through the din. I launched a wave of concussive force outward, a kinetic ripple that knocked the front rank of attackers off their feet, buying us 3 seconds of air. He spun toward me, teeth bared, almost not recognizing me in his blood-drunk state. "We can't win this here," I shouted, grabbing his arm. His skin was burning hot, his muscles bunched like steel cables beneath the blood-slicked fur. "We have to move. We need to break the encirclement." He blinked, the intelligence slowly filtering back into his feral gaze. He looked at the wall of wolves, regrouping for another charge, then up at Marcus on the ramparts, then back at me. "Where?" he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. I looked behind us into the terrified, huddled misery of the outer ring slums, the shanties of wood and tarp dry as kindling. A cold, cruel idea sparked in my mind. If we couldn't beat the army, we had to change the battlefield. We needed chaos, and I knew exactly how to make it. "We're leaving," I said, my grip tightening on his arm, "and we're lighting the way." The magic was a siphon now, a sucking chest wound, draining my vitality with every defensive pulse. My core, usually a sun-drenched well of summer power, felt thin and cold, like weak tea water. I was vibrating with exhaustion, my teeth clenched so hard I tasted metallic fillings. Damien was a glorious, terrifying meat grinder, but he was stationary. He was fighting a holding action in a kill box, lost in the sheer, overwhelming novelty of seeing the things he was butchering. He was drunk on adrenaline and the sensory overload of sight restored in the middle of a massacre. He would stand there and slaughter them until they buried him under a mountain of corpses, and I would burn out trying to keep him alive long enough to do it. We were going to die here, unless I changed the rules. I looked past the melee, past the terrified, huddled masses of the human slaves cowering in the mud, to the shanty town itself, the outer ring. It was a sprawling, cancerous growth of untreated timber, tarred canvas, and compacted despair, dried tinder waiting for a spark. I didn't hesitate. There was no room for conscience when you were standing ankle-deep in blood with an army trying to eat you. The humans living there were already victims. I was just about to make them refugees. I yanked my hand back from Damien's slick bicep, breaking physical contact. I needed the concentration. I didn't bother with blinding light or focus plasma bolts this time. I went for raw, indiscriminate thermal ignition. I gathered the remaining bulk of my power, ignoring the sickening lurch in my stomach as the tank ran dry, and pushed heat outward in a massive, shimmering wave. It wasn't subtle. The air instantly warped, superheating in a translucent dome over the nearest cluster of hovels. The effect was apocalyptic. The shacks didn't just catch fire, they erupted. Tar paper vaporized into thick, choking black smoke. Dry, rot-infested wood splintered with the sound of gunfire as the moisture inside boiled instantly. Within seconds, a wall of orange and red fury roared to life, towering over the battlefield, casting obscene shadows against the castle walls. The noise was deafening, a rushing, consuming roar that drowned out Marcus's screams from the ramparts. Chaos is a ladder, and I had just built one out of fire. The wolves on the perimeter panicked. Fire is primal terror for anything with fur, and this wasn't a campfire, it was an inferno. The synchronized discipline of the pack shattered. The flankers wavered, ears flattened against their skulls, torn between their alpha's orders and the ancient mammalian instinct to flee the flames. The humans screamed, a wretched chorus that tore at my dwindling humanity, and scattered like ants under a magnifying glass, abandoning their meager possessions to the blaze. Damien didn't even notice. He was busy burying his snout in the throat of a guard who had gotten too close, lost in the red haze. He was drowning in sensory input, the copper tang of fresh blood mixing with the acrid stench of burning hair and roasting meat. I had to be his anchor. I grabbed him again, digging my nails fiercely into his shoulder, drawing fresh blood just to get his attention through the fog of war. "Damien, move!" I shrieked over the roar of the conflagration. He whipped his head around, teeth bared in a snarl that was almost indiscriminate. His eyes were wild, pupils blown wide, reflecting the towering flames like pools of oil. He looked insane. He looked ready to kill me too. "The fire, Damien! Run toward the fire!" I shoved him hard toward a narrow, smoke-choked alley between two burning structures that led toward the outer perimeter fence. For a second he resisted, the wolf brain wanting to stay and fight to finish the kill, and the searing heat hit his face and something clicked. The survival instinct overrode the bloodlust. He grabbed my wrist, his grip bone-crushing, and hauled me forward. We ran straight into hell. The heat was staggering, It sucked the moisture from my eyes and dried the blood on my skin into a tight, cracking mask. Smoke billowed, thick and sulfuric, stinging my lungs, coating my throat with ash. We were running blind again, navigating by the intense heat on either side of their narrow path. It was a nightmare navigation. We trampled over abandoned bedding and broken cookpots, dodging fleeing humans who emerged from the smoke like soot-stained ghosts, eyes wide with terror at the sight of the blood-drenched alpha and the witch who had lit their world on fire. A tracker wolf, scorched and coughing, burst through a collapsing wall of burning canvas right in front of us. Before he could orient himself, Damien hit him. It wasn't a fight, it was a high-speed collision. Damien didn't even slow down, dropping his shoulder and plowing the smaller wolf into a burning support beam. The structure collapsed on top of the tracker, in a shower of sparks and burning timber. We kept running. My lungs were burning, my legs feeling heavy as lead as the adrenaline crash began to set in. We were leaving a trail of charred destruction behind us, a pyre for the life I had lived for the past month. Through the shimmering heat haze ahead, I saw it. The outer perimeter fence, 12 feet of rusted chain link topped with razor wire, meant to keep the slaves in, not the wolves out. We skidded to a halt in the mud before it. I was gasping, coughing up black phlegm. My magic was sputtering, a dying ember in wet ash. I didn't have the juice to blast through steel. "The fence!" I choked out, leaning against a fence post that was already hot to the touch. "Damien, tear it down!" He looked at the metal barrier, then back at the wall of fire consuming the slums behind us, hearing the approaching howls of Marcus's guards regrouping through the smoke. He didn't hesitate. He threw his head back and let out a roar that rivaled the fire's fury, then threw his massive, blood-slicked body at the fence. His claws screeched against the metal mesh, sparks flying as he hooked his fingers in and ripped. The rusted metal groaned and shrieked, peeling back like wet cardboard under his unnatural strength, opening a jagged maw into the unknown darkness beyond the estate. We scrambled through, leaving the light, the heat, and the screaming behind us, plunging into the cold, terrified silence of the outside world. We scrambled through the jagged tear in the fence, the rusty metal screaming as it peeled back, mirroring the raw state of my own lungs. We tumbled out of the scorching chaos of the burning outer ring and into the cold, damp, unforgiving embrace of the concrete sprawl surrounding the estate. The transition was binary, from fire and screaming to an eerie, artificial half-light and a silence that wasn't silent at all, but filled with the low-frequency hum of a human city that never truly slept. We were out, free, and it felt like drowning. The adrenaline crash hit me first, and turning my limbs to useless putty. I stumbled, slick with other wolves' blood and my own sweat, dropping to one knee on the rain-slicked asphalt of a narrow service alley. I was dry-heaving, black ash and bile scratching my throat. My core was empty, a cold, hollow shell where the summer fire should be singing. I looked up, looking for Damien, expecting him to be pulling me to my feet, already planning our evasion. He was standing 10 feet away, paralyzed. He hadn't moved since we breached the perimeter. He stood in the center of the alley, legs locked, his head turning in slow, jerky, horrified arcs. He was panting, a dry, rhythmic sound that told me he was close to hyperventilating. I realized with a sickening lurch that while I was processing the exhaustion, he was processing the collapse of his entire universe. For 20 years, his world had been defined by scent, sound, and touch. It was a close, intimate, reliable world. Now the blindfold was off, and reality was crashing into his mind like a high-velocity train. The human city at night was a sensory slaughterhouse for a newborn alpha. Overhead, a sodium streetlight flickered, casting a harsh, oscillating orange glow that must have felt like a strobe light to eyes that hadn't seen in decades. The modern architecture, all jagged concrete and rusting dumpsters, was alien to him. Car alarms chirped in the distance. The low thrum of traffic on a nearby highway resonated through his enhanced hearing like tectonic plates shifting. And the smells. The wolf's greatest strength was now his poison. The clean, metallic scent of blood and ozone was gone, replaced by the pungent, synthetic olfactory vomit of a human industrial center. Exhaust fumes, stale urine, rotting garbage from the restaurant dumpsters, the chemical burn of asphalt, the sickening sweetness of cheap air fresheners from open windows. It was overwhelming him, suffocating his keenest instinct. He looked at me, and I saw the terror. Pure, unadulterated, primal panic in those milky blue eyes. "Damien!" I whispered, my voice cracked and barely audible over the roaring echo of their distant fire. I didn't dare speak louder. His hearing would transform a normal speaking voice into a scream. He didn't hear me. He was watching the blinking hand of a crosswalk signal at the end of the alley, completely entranced and horrified by the rhythm of it. I forced myself up, every muscle screaming in protest, and crossed the distance to him. I was careful not to approach from his visual blind spot, stepping fully into the orange streetlight. I needed to be a physical anchor, or he was going to lose his mind entirely. I reached out and grabbed his arm. His skin was fever hot, and he was vibrating so hard I felt my teeth rattle through my fingers. "Damien, look at me," I said, pitching my voice low and authoritative, channeling whatever remnants of fey command I could muster through my exhaustion. His gaze snapped to mine. The focus was there, but it was brittle. He was looking at me, but he was seeing the entire world exploding around my head. He blinked rapidly, his jaw tight enough to crack his teeth. "It's loud," he grated out, the sound ripped from his chest. "So bright. Everything is wrong." I know it is," I said, keeping my eyes locked on his, providing a static point in the chaos. "But we can't stay here. The fence won't hold them, and the fire won't keep them distracted for long." As if my words were a summon, a howl sliced through the low thrum of the city noises. It was close, maybe 2 miles. A long, mournful sound, sharp with purpose. Marcus hadn't sent the heavy infantry this time. He was sending the trackers, the lithe, lean wolves bred for speed and scent, not combat. They would be faster than the fire, and they wouldn't stop. Damien heard it. His ears twitched, flattening against his skull. The instinct to flee fought with the sensory overload. "Damien," I said, gripping his biceps hard, trying to shove my own determination through the skin-to-skin contact. "I need you to listen to me. I need you to trust me. The city is my territory. I know how to navigate this mess, but you have to move." He looked at the end of the alley, toward the blinding, terrifying expanse of the street, then back at me. I could see the brute calculation in his eyes, the man wrestling the panicking animal down. He was the alpha. He shouldn't be relying on a slave, but he was blind in a new way, and I was the only thing holding the world still. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw clenching. He nodded once, a sharp, angry jerk of his head. He didn't like it, but he wasn't a fool. "Lead," he commanded, his voice shaking but the iron resolve slipping back in. I grabbed his gore-slicked hand. The physical connection was clinical, born of necessity, but charged with the adrenaline of the hunt. I couldn't glamour us, I couldn't defend us, my magic was gone. I only had my knowledge of the concrete jungle. We began to run, plunging deeper into the hostile, alien maze of the human city, 2 fugitives drenched in blood, running blind through the lights. Running was agony, a rhythmic, bone-jarring penance for outliving the night. We moved through the auxiliary veins of the city, narrow alleys slick with a nauseating slurry of rainwater, dumpster leakage, and the chemical sweat of industrial machinery. Every slapping footfall on the cracked asphalt vibrated up my shin bones, echoing the hammer-blow rhythm of my exhausted heart. I was a fae, yes, but I was currently a starving fae, my well dry, holding on to consciousness by sheer, stubborn spit and spite. Beside me, Damien was a specter of raw violence and paralyzing fear. He ran with the power of a locomotive, but it was graceless, fueled by panic. He was processing the visual input of the city at a breakneck pace, his head twitching at the reflections in puddles, the sharp angles of concrete, the alien glow of neon. Every distant siren, every car alarm that chirped made him flinch, nearly sending him sprawling. I was holding his gore-slicked hand, not as a lover, but as a blind man's cane. Without my grip, the sensory onslaught would have anchored him to the spot to be slaughtered. The howls were closer now. Less a mournful call, more a sharp, synchronized signal. They were navigating by the trail of blood and the pervasive scent of summer fire we left behind like breadcrumbs. We had 15 minutes max before they were in visual range. "There," I rasped, my throat raw with smoke and effort. I pulled him sharply to the left. We skidded around the corner of a derelict warehouse, stopping before a rusty, graffiti-covered metal grate set into the concrete pavement. Through the bars, the heavy, stale breath of the underground drifted up, a foul cocktail of damp earth, rust, ozone, and rodents. It was disgusting. It was perfect. I looked at the padlock securing the grate. It was heavy, industrial-grade steel. I didn't have a spark of magic left to heat it, nor the strength to leverage it open. I dropped Damien's hand and looked at him. He was staring at a flickering streetlight, breathing in shallow, terrified hitches. "Damien!" I grabbed his shoulders, forcing his milky blue eyes to meet mine. I kept my voice just above a whisper, terrified his enhanced hearing would magnify it into a scream. We have to go down. I need you to open this now. He looked from me to the heavy metal grate, then up at the darkening hostile sky. The human, rational part of him fought down the animal panic. He nodded once, a short, violent gesture. He knelt, grasping the thick steel bars with hands that had gutted 4 wolves tonight. He exhaled, a low, guttural growl, and pulled upward. The sound was atrocious, the scream of tortured metal on concrete, followed by the wet snap of the padlock mechanism shattering. He tore the grate open, revealing the abyssal darkness of a ladder chute leading down into a forgotten maintenance section of the old metro. I didn't hesitate. I slid onto the rungs, ignoring the slick grease and biting rust, descending into the dark. Damien followed, his bulk nearly filling the chute, his ragged breathing echoing around us. We hit the bottom, 20 feet down, on a concrete floor, slippery with unidentifiable slime. It was pitch black to any human eye, but for me, and now for Damien, it was an undulating tableau of grays, blacks, and strange thermal currents. The space was claustrophobic, filled with the low hum of distant subway tracks, the drip of stagnant water and the rustling of small, scuttling things. The silence was heavy here, pressing in on us. We had escaped the chaos of the streets, but the danger hadn't changed. Only the venue. My core finally gave out. The last ember of adrenaline flickered and died, and my legs dissolved. I crumpled against the slime-slicked brick wall, sliding down into a puddle of cold, rank water. I was dry heaving again, black phlegm burning my throat. The howls drifted down the chute, muffled but undeniable. They were directly above us on the street. No, I moaned, fighting the wave of blackness threatening my vision. Not like this. I had to block the scent. The glamour was the most basic of fey magics, an illusion, but it required an internal power source I didn't have. I was scratching at the bottom of an empty tank, trying to gather sparks of static electricity. I closed my eyes, visualizing the heavy, sulfuric scent of the metro, the rust, the feces, the mold, magnifying it in my mind. I took that olfactory picture and tried to smear it over us, to weave it into a shroud. The physical cost was brutal. It felt like I was pulling my own nerves out through my pores, weaving my vitality into a physical veil. A white-hot needle of pain transfixed my temple. My skin went deathly cold as my internal temperature plummeted, sacrificed to sustain the illusion. It was a clumsy glamour, thin and unstable, but it was all I had. A shimmering, oily layer settled in the air around us, masking the pungent copper of the dried blood coating both of our bodies. I exhaled, a sound that was less a breath and more a rattle of collapse, and fell backward, my consciousness fraying at the edges. I didn't hit the brick wall. I hit something warm, solid, and covered in matted fur. Damien had moved. He had dropped to his knees, catching me as I fell, propping me up against his chest. His arms, thick with hard muscle and dried gore, were around me, not crushing me, but supporting me with a strange, careful gentleness that felt alien coming from him. I was too weak to push him away. I was too weak to care. I was freezing, and he was a furnace. I leaned into his warmth, burying my face against his broad shoulder, ignoring the stench of the blood that was not his own. He didn't speak. I could feel the powerful, irregular thump of his heart against my ribs. I could feel the vibration of his shallow breathing. He was still processing the sensory overload. The drip of the water must have sounded like gunshots to him down here, but he was functional. The dynamic had cracked. The alpha and the slave, the aggressor and the victim. We were just 2 injured animals trapped in the dark, bleeding into the same slime, mutual survival, the only language we understood. I lay against him, listening to the muffled howls of the trackers overhead, waiting for the illusion to hold, or for the darkness to finally take me.
The darkness wasn't black anymore. That was the first terrifying realization that registered through the exhaustion and the adrenaline crash. For 2 decades, black was the absolute absence, a comforting, heavy blanket over my mind. Now the dark was gray. It was textured. It was visible. I was lying against the slick, moss-covered brickwork of the abandoned tunnel, and I could see the bricks. I could see the cracks in the mortar, the wet green shimmer of the algae, the drip of water forming a puddle that sent rings shimmering outward, clear as crystal. My body was a battlefield, but a battlefield with the lights turned on. I looked at my hands resting in the muddy water. They were massive, dark things, illuminated by some internal light covered in a sticky maroon glaze that I knew was blood but now had a physical reflective texture. I could see the fingernails I'd used to tear the grate, the fine hairs, the veins pulsing under the olive skin. It was fascinating and horrifying. I ran my tongue over my teeth, tasting the iron and ozone. My enhanced hearing, my oldest friend, was still there, mapping the dripping water and the scuttling rats. But now it was joined by this upstart sense, mapping the shapes of those things, confirming their existence visually. The physical strain was immense. My lungs felt raw, filled with the taste of sulfur and burning trash. My muscles, usually an endless reservoir of power, felt depleted, vibrating with a fatigue I hadn't known since the training pits. But the sensory world was expanding and not just filling. Before, sight was overwhelming noise. Now, here in the close dark, it was clarifying. The reason was in my arms. I was huddled around Irene. She was collapsed against my chest, a small, fragile weight of muscle and heat. Her glamour, the thin, shimmering film she'd tried to cast over us to mask the smell, was visible. It wasn't just a scent, it was an undulating, translucent barrier that warped the grayscale visual of the tunnel. A bubble of illusion I was sitting inside. Physical contact was the key. I could feel it. Since the moment in the outer ring when she'd grasped my arm, the sensory floodgate had thrown open wider. Now, with her entire body pressed against me, the visual dimension was impossibly sharp. It felt like her proximity provided not just power, but a buffer, a filter that allowed my mind to process the light instead of being shattered by it. A pulse of energy, faint but unmistakable, vibrated from her skin to mine, a symbiotic circuit. I wasn't just touching her, I was leeching off her. I was pulling her vital force, the residual trace of whatever magic she had left, and channeling it into my optic nerve. I shifted slightly, propping her up. My hand brushed her arm and a tiny green spark jumped between our skin. In the gray world, it was brighter than any sun. It made me look at her, really look at her. For the first time since she was presented to the council as a human humiliation, I saw Irene. Her skin, usually a flat black in the human quarter, was a mosaic of deep, rich shadows and surprising highlights in the grayscale view. Her face was gaunt, the exhaustion digging canyons under her eyes, her lips cracked and stained with ash. The blood that wasn't hers was smeared across her cheek like war paint. She was terrifyingly human and utterly exquisite. But the real revelation was what lay beneath the flesh. I looked beyond the physical structure and I saw her core. It wasn't a physical organ, but a point of light, located just below her ribcage. Usually I imagined it would be the bright, blinding light of summer she always channeled. Now it was dim. It was a dying coal sputtering, barely visible, a fragile flame fighting against an overwhelming darkness. Around this flickering core I could see her energy signature, her aura. It wasn't the blazing green supernova I'd seen earlier when she unleashed her power. That had burned out. Now it was a fine, intricate web of pulsing light, silvers and pale blues, winding through her body like a secondary nervous system. It was faint, fragile and beautiful. The highborn fae stripped down to her last reserve of light, using her own vitality to weave the very illusion that was hiding us. I looked back at her face, her eyes closed in collapse. I remembered that just weeks ago I had broken this woman. I had despised her, seen her only as a biological key to my own restoration. The cognitive dissonance twisted my gut. This was the enemy, the spy, the reason my ancestors were blinded. And yet she was my anchor, my visual translator, the source of the very light that was letting me see the path to escape. We were symbionts, fused by a blood debt and mutual survival. I wasn't her alpha and she wasn't my slave. We were just two beasts huddled in the dark, and for the first time I could see exactly what I was holding.
Waking up was worse than falling unconscious. It was the slow, painful realization that the nightmare hadn't ended, it had just stabilized in the dark. Everything hurt. A dull, thudding ache behind my eyes, a grinding pain in my ribs where I must have landed, and a bone-deep, rattling chill that had settled into my marrow. The air in the tunnel was foul. Stagnant water, ancient rust, rodent droppings, and the metallic, cloying tang of dried blood. Our blood. I was lying in the cold muck, but I wasn't freezing, not entirely. There was a wall of heat pressing against my back, wrapped around my side. Damien. He was still holding me. I could feel the rhythmic, powerful rise and fall of his chest, the slow, heavy, thudding thump of his heart against my ribs. He hadn't just propped me up. He'd pulled me into himself. Curled around me in the mud, like a lion protecting its kill or a beast protecting its anchor. I tried to shift to create just an inch of distance, but my muscles simply refused. They were disconnected, paralyzed by complete magical and physical burnout. I was a puppet, with the strings cut, completely at the mercy of the beast that was keeping me warm. The drain. That's what it was. I could feel the static connection between our skin. It wasn't the violent, tearing draw of the rape, but a low-voltage, relentless, passive pull. He was siphoning the last molecular traces of vitality from me. I was the battery powering whatever new visual dimension he was currently exploring. I felt a flash of old, hot rage. The irony was so bitter I could taste it over the blood in my mouth. My mission was to destabilize the pack, to incite a civil war, to bring the estate down in ashes. And here I was, trapped in the sewer, serving as the biological filter and life support for the heir to the very council I intended to destroy. I was the poison chalice, but now I was the only antidote. Another howl drifted down the maintenance chute, muffled, distant, but moving. They were on the street directly above us now. They had found the location, where we went to ground, but not the exact entrance. Yet. I closed my eyes and tried to push one more spark of will into the glamour I'd woven. Just enough to thicken the illusion, to smear more scent, to make us look like ancient mud instead of fresh meat. A hot spike of pain drove through my temple, blinding and white. My vision grayed out completely. There was nothing left. I had scraped the bottom of my internal well, and all I found was dry earth and agony. My breath hitched, a desperate, panicking rattle in my chest. I couldn't hold the illusion. We were going to die here. Damien sensed the panic. He always sensed the internal shifts now. His grip tightened, his massive, gore-slicked arm moving from supporting me to pinning me against him. It wasn't intended to harm, but the sheer physical mass of him was absolute. His other hand shifted from my shoulder to the side of my neck, his fingers pressing against my jugular. I stiffened. This is it. He thinks I'm a lost cause. He's going to snap my neck rather than let the council's trackers take me. A strong jolt of connection, hot, electric, and terrifyingly intimate, raced from his fingertips, cascading through my nervous system. It was identical to the moment in the study when we first touched. An acknowledgement. He was using my closeness, my aura, as a focal point to stabilize his expanding world. He was looking at me, not through me. He lowered his head, his face inches from mine. I could feel his breath, hot and tasting of ozone on my cheek. "Breathe," he commanded, the word low, rattling and resonant, stripped of the alpha's roar but holding all of his power. I didn't have the strength to refuse. I was trapped between the cold slime and the crushing heat of my enemy, entirely at his mercy, and I took a shaking breath, submitting to the symbiotic cage.
She was slipping. Even in the profound darkness of the tunnel, which to my new eyes was a textured map of grays and moving energy currents, I could see her core sputtering. It was a dying coal, radiating less and less of the heat and complex silvery blue web of light that I was clinging to. The thin, shimmering membrane of glamour she had managed to cast, that fragile bubble of filtered scent and warped light wrapping around us, was dissolving. It pulsed, fading from visible energy back into simple, cold atmosphere. The trackers above were silent now. That was worse than the howling. It meant they were done signaling. They had narrowed the search grid. They were moving into tactical pursuit positions, closing off exits. Then I heard it through the thick concrete and metal above, the screech of tortured metal. The same sound I had made moments ago. They had found the maintenance grate. They were coming down. Panic, cold, sharp, and smelling of ozone surged from Irene's body into mine. It was a physical jolt. Her heart, once a slow, dying rhythm against my chest, began a frantic, erratic hammering. Her aura fractured. the elegant lines of silver snapping like over-tightened violin strings. My visual feed immediately corrupted. The stable grayscale world shattered. Statues of concrete became melting smears. The puddle of water turned into a jagged void of static. It felt like white-hot needles were being driven back through my eyes into my brain. The sensory input without her stable filter was turning back into agony. I couldn't lose the sight, not now. My instincts, raw and ancient, overrode the military logic and the fear. My hand locked around her throat tightened, not to crush her windpipe but to anchor her, to stop the frantic vibration of her aura. I lowered my head, my face inches from hers. I could smell the terror on her skin beneath the dried gore and slime. It was sweet, like overripe fruit, and sharp like copper. I pressed my forehead against hers, skin on skin, a direct neural connection. "Breathe," I commanded. My voice was a rattle of granite on bone, the low, powerful resonance of an alpha. But I didn't direct it at her as a slave. I directed it at the core inside her, at the source of the light. "Feed off me, bomb. Stabilize the circuit." I pushed my own kinetic energy, the brute force of my heartbeat, the heat of my rage, into her through the points of contact. I don't know if it was magic or biology, but it was a transaction. I was the generator, she was the current. The surge was electric. Her breath hitched, a gasp that rattled with fluids and exhaustion. But she inhaled. She pulled my raw warmth inside her, channeling it back into the sputtering coal. The reaction was immediate. Her core didn't blaze, but the fracturing lines of her aura snapped back together, thin and stable. The jolt hit my brain, filtering the static. The melting world resolved. The static grid hardened back into the sewer tunnel, gray and sharp. It was working, but the trackers were closer. I could hear the rhythmic clack hiss of their talons on the metal rungs of the ladder 30 feet above us, 4 of them, big ones. Beta class or higher. Marcus had sent the elite. They hit the concrete bottom with a heavy, wet thud that vibrated through the mud and up into my bones. Even without scent, they were good. They began to fan out in a standard suppression formation. I pulled Irene closer, pinning her securely against my chest with my left arm. I needed her alive. Not just for the visual feed, but because I was beginning to realize that if she died, a part of my own newly expanded mind would simply seize and burn out. We were symbionts, fused by blood and necessity. I looked at the leading edge of the tracker team, a massive wolf with a scar that made his jaw hang askew. Even through the filter, I could see the visual noise radiating off him. The red shimmer of aggression, the dense, packed energy of his muscles. He stopped, tilting his massive head. He couldn't smell us through her dissolved glamour, not fully, but he could hear us. He could sense the displacement of air. He growled, a low vibration that confirmed visual contact even in the dark. I rose from the mud, hoisting Irene's dead weight. She was conscious, her eyes wide, staring at me with a mixture of terror and awe as my own milky, sightless gaze swept across the attackers. The cognitive dissonance hit me, sharp and bitter, the enemy, the traitor, my key to power. I tightened my grip on her, my massive hand locked onto her waist, pulling her vital, terrifying current directly into my body. I let out my own howl, not a call for help, but a predator's promise. The lead wolf charged, and I could see the exact angle, the muscular tension and the shimmering weak point in his throat clearer than I had ever seen anything in my life.
The howl tore through Damien's chest, vibrating against my own ribs with such force it felt like my internal organs were being rearranged. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical shockwave. I was dead weight in his arms, paralyzed by magic burnout and raw physical exhaustion, yet I felt everything. I felt the instantaneous shift in his muscles from tense to explosive. I felt the terrifying speed with which he moved. Then, impact. The lead tracker, a monstrosity of muscle and scar tissue, hit us like a runaway freight train. The sound of their collision was a sickening wet thud mixed with the grinding crunch of concrete. We were slammed backward, my head whipping violently. If I'd been alone, I would have been crushed. Instead, I was encased in a cage of steel. Damien absorbed the bulk of the impact, his left arm locked around my waist, tightening to a degree that I thought would snap my spine. It was agony, but it was the only thing keeping me in one piece. My vision, already failing, turned into a kaleidoscope of gray, flickering static. The only constant was the intense stinging heat where my skin touched his. The symbiotic draw was now a furious, erratic siphoning. He was draining my last reserves of vital energy, not as a slow trickle, but to power this instantaneous surge of brute strength. I could feel his heart hammering against my back, a massive, furious war drum. The smell of copper and ozone became suffocating. Damien didn't retreat. He countercharged using the momentum of their own attack against them. I felt him twist, a violent, kinetic rotation of his hips. I was dragged through a pipe rider through the cold muck, spray flying. He used his immense mass to hurl the lead wolf into the dripping concrete wall. The sound of the beast's skull cracking was terrifyingly loud in the tunnel's echo. It dropped to the mud, whimpering, but the others were moving. They didn't attack like soldiers, they attacked like pack hunters, in silence. Through our connection, I felt Damien's perception shift. It wasn't sight as I knew it, and certainly not the magical sight I once possessed. It was something raw and predatory. I felt his mind cataloging the grayscale visual of the oncoming wolves, mapping their trajectories based on the subtle vibrations they made in the water and the air, filtered through the stability I provided. He was using my body as a focus point, a biological lens that clarified the noise. He dropped low, taking me with him. I could taste the iron from my own cracked lips. Another tracker lunged over us, its claws snapping inches from my face. Damien didn't block. He reacted. He swung his massive, blood-slicked right fist upward, a devastating uppercut that connected with the tracker's exposed, soft underbelly. I felt the wet, ripping sensation travel through his limb into mine. He leaned into me, his breathing ragged and hot against my ear. It wasn't intimacy. It was a connection of desperate, violent necessity. "Stabilize," he snarled, the single word a vibrate against my neck. I didn't want to. I wanted to let go, to sink into the cold darkness and let the trackers rip him apart, but I couldn't. Not when my survival was inextricable from his. The sheer instinct to live overrode my hatred. I clenched my eyes shut, channeling my remaining will into the connection. I couldn't weave glamour, but I could anchor my awareness. I stopped fighting the draw. I let him take it. The result was agonizing. It felt like my very nerve endings were being flayed, the energy ripping out of me in hot bursts. But it worked. I felt his muscles stabilize. I felt his visual feed, shared through the neural link, crystallize. The gray tunnel became sharp, etched in details of texture and movement. He could see the intricate web of silver lines of muscle tension in the remaining trackers. And more importantly, he could see the angry red fractures of weakness in the one he had previously slammed into the wall. He moved again, faster this time, powered by the fresh surge of my vitality. He became a blur of dark shadow and violence. He didn't just fight, he systematically tore through them. One lunged at me, recognizing the symbiotic anchor. Damien interceded, taking the bite on his shoulder. I felt the razor-sharp teeth sinking into his flesh through the shared link, a secondary, stinging pain that matched my own depletion. He didn't flinch. He used the grip to slam the wolf into the concrete, his free hand locking around its jaw. With a wrenching motion that vibrated through my own skeleton, I heard the snap of bone. The wolf went limp. There was only one left, and the first one, still dazed, was trying to rise. Damien was heavily wounded. I was nearly gone, my vision blurring into a final, dying tunnel of dark red. The smell of death was absolute. He didn't need to kill them all. He just needed to clear a path. He didn't put me down. He clamped me tighter, pulling my empty body into his bleeding chest, and howled. It was a promise of mutual destruction. We were symbionts, fused in blood and violence, and even as I faded, I knew this beast would never let me go. The violence ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a silence in the tunnel far heavier than the noise of the struggle. I was lying in the cold muck again, though I had no memory of being lowered there. My body felt distant, a heavy, unresponsive object attached to my consciousness by frayed threads. The world was a chaotic blur of dark grays and muffled dragging sounds. My vision was failing rapidly, the connection that allowed Damien to see was sputtering out, plunging me into a premature visual coma. But I felt him. Always I felt him. The symbiotic pull was no longer a furious siphoning. It had settled into a steady, relentless, thrumming ache. He was keeping the connection alive, tapping into the very bottom of my well just to maintain a baseline of sense. I heard his breathing, harsh and rattling, right above me. He was wounded, bad. I could feel the hot drip of his blood landing on my cheek, mixing with the slime and my own cold sweat. A massive hand, slick with gore, fumbled for my shoulder, gripping it with unnecessary force. He was stabilizing himself against me. I felt his pain through the connection, not as sharp, agonizing stings, but as a dull, thudding bass note undergirding the entire symbiotic link. His shoulder was shredded, the bone chipped. I felt the wet heat of it. I should have felt triumphant. The monster was broken. Instead, I felt a wave of crushing despair. If he fell here, I fell. We were inextricably chained, not by the Council's humiliating mate decree, but by a biological and magical necessity far more profound and terrifying. Through the faint, dying neural link, I processed his environment. It wasn't sight anymore, but a chaotic tapestry of texture and vibration. He was analyzing the 4 massive heaps of flesh surrounding us. 3 were motionless, their cores extinguished, radiating only fading heat. The 4th, the lead wolf, was still twitching in the mud, its breath a fluid rattle. It had fought hardest, and I felt a wave of Damien's cold, predatory appreciation for its tenacity. He shifted, lifting his weight from me, and the temporary reprieve from the crushing pressure allowed me to gasp. The air tasted of iron and decay. I heard the sound of his claws extending, a wet, precise snick. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to know, but through the link, I felt the sharp thrust of his hand, felt the resistance of muscle and bone giving way, and the momentary, bright burst of energy as the lead wolf's life was extinguished. He drew his hand back, and the link spiked with a sickening cocktail of exhaustion, pain, and dark satisfaction. He was fueled by the violence. It was the only thing keeping him vertical. I felt him lower himself again, his massive form hovering over me. The heat radiating off him was immense. "Can you move?" his voice rasped, the tone stripped of all alpha command, reduced to bare survival. I tried to speak, but only a wet rattle emerged. I tried to lift my hand, but my fingers only curled uselessly in the mud. I was completely, utterly burned out. His hand shifted from my shoulder to the side of my neck, his fingers pressing into my pulse point. Skin on skin, the contact was electric, stinging my exhausted nerves. He was tapping into me again, checking the fuel gauge. He let out a growl, a low sound of frustration and desperation that I felt vibrate through my skull. Then I was lifted, not gently, not with care, but with the rough efficiency of a scavenger retrieving a useful tool. He slung me over his uninjured shoulder like a sack of dead weight. The sudden shift in perspective, the compression of my ribs against his bone, sent a wave of nausea through me. My vision grayed out completely. I was conscious yet entirely passive, a captive entity in a symbiotic cage. He was walking now, a swaying, heavy gait, moving deeper into the absolute darkness of the maintenance tunnel. I could hear the squelch clack of his boots in the mud and blood. The trackers had come from the chute above. He was heading the other way, toward the forgotten subterranean network that serviced the human city, deeper into the labyrinth. As he walked, the symbiotic pull deepened, stabilizing. He was settling into a rhythm. He was using me as a compass, a biological GPS, letting my proximity clarify the sensory noise of the pitch-black tunnels. I hated him. With every fiber of my being, I hated him. I hated the council that bound us, the pack that hunted us, and the fate that had made my survival depend on this monster's endurance. But as I dangled over his bleeding shoulder, the absolute darkness pressing in, I realized I was fighting a war on too many fronts. My family was dead. My ancestors' plague was the reason Damien was blind. He was my ancestral enemy, and now he was my only shield. To bring down the council, I had to keep the poison chalice intact. I closed my eyes, submitting to the symbiotic cage, and forced myself to breathe his air, waiting for the darkness to finally take me. The passage of time became a fluid concept, measured only by the rhythmic, jarring bounce of Damien's stride and the agonizing, consistent siphon on my core. I was suspended in a state that was not quite sleep, not quite consciousness, a gray limbo of physical paralysis. My limbs dangled over his uninjured shoulder, useless as heavy ropes. Every jolt sent a spike of nausea through my empty stomach, a feeling that processed itself through the neural link as a blur of sickly green static in Damien's perception. He didn't care. He moved with a brutal, relentless momentum, deep into the labyrinthine gut of the human city's infrastructure. The air here was older than in the sewer tunnel, smelling intensely of rust, damp concrete, and the faint, sweet decay of stagnant water. It was a suffocating cocktail that I tasted on the back of my tongue. Through the link, I could feel the map of the tunnels hardening in his mind. I wasn't just stabilizing his vision anymore. I was a living component of his navigational array. My proximity filtered out the overwhelming sensory noise of the pitch-black labyrinth, the confusing echoes, the complex scent trails of rats and human refuse, allowing him to focus only on the structural reality. He could see the angle of the walls, the texture of the floor, the rust-eaten ladders ascending into darkness. The price for this clarity was exacted from my flesh. Where my body was pressed against his, my ribcage against his clavicle, his hand gripping my thigh to keep me secure. It felt as though my skin was being flayed by microscopic electrical currents. The parasitic connection was deeper now, tapping not just into my reserves, but into the bedrock energy of my cells. It was a burning, hollow ache that localized in my marrow. I wanted to scream, to lash out, and to sever the connection and plunge him into the madness of sensory overload. I wanted to see him crumble in the dark. But then, a shift. Through the link, I felt his visual field stutter. A wave of exhaustion wash over him. The immense physical strain of the battle, combined with his own significant blood loss, was finally overriding his alpha endurance. He was running on fumes. His gait became uneven. I felt his foot slip slightly in a patch of slime. He corrected instantly, a spasm of furious will tightening his muscles, but the weakness was there, exposed. He slowed. "Stop trying to fight it," his voice came, a low vibrate that sounded pulverized against my back. I hadn't realized I was fighting it until he said it. In the deepest recesses of my mind, I was instinctively clinging to my remaining embers, raising a micro-thin mental barrier against his siphon. My core was a bunker, and he was pounding on the door. I looked at him. Or rather, I processed the image he saw of himself in a rare, brief flash of self-perception that slipped through the link. He was a mess of raw energy and physical devastation. His left arm was nearly useless, the muscles shredded. The energy I was feeding him was the only thing holding him upright. If I held back, the circuit would break. He would fall, and I would fall with him, a helpless captive in a darkness where I had no power. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The irony was suffocating. The very monster I had come to destroy was the only thing preventing my complete annihilation by my own kind. The council would take my head, where I would die slow and cold in this tunnel. Damien was a brutal savior. My hatred hadn't lessened, but it was now a tactical resource, not just raw emotion. I needed him to live. I needed this circuit to hold. I forced myself to relax. It was an act of extreme will, a conscious surrender of my deepest defenses. I lowered my internal barriers. The rush of energy from me to him was instantaneous and overwhelming. It felt like I was bleeding light. My vision, a final, flickering thread of internal awareness, grayed out completely. I felt Damien gasp, a deep inhalation that shuddered through his chest. Through the link, the world didn't just crystallize, it expanded. The gray texture map exploded into high-definition detail. He could see the intricate fractal pattern of the rust on the ventilation pipes overhead. He could see the distinct heat signatures of the tiny insects moving on the wall. The cognitive processing required was immense, but I was absorbing the load. His step normalized. The power flow was stable. He was now moving at a punishing pace, fueled by my deliberate surrender. He was no longer just a predator. He was a precision machine cutting through the darkness. He took a sharp turn, then another. The environment changed again, the concrete walls giving way to older circular brickwork. The sound of running water grew louder. We were approaching a central artery. As he walked, I felt a strange, cold intimacy settle into the symbiotic bond. We were no longer two distinct entities fighting in a dark tunnel. We were one system. My energy, his force, my focus, his direction. It was the ultimate humiliation, far worse than the mate decree. He had conquered my very identity, making me an extension of himself. I closed my eyes in my gray limbo, and for the first time, I didn't fight the pull. I let him drain me, waiting with agonizing patience for the day I would be strong enough to make this circuit overload and burn us both to ash. The rhythmic jolt of Damien's stride was the only thing keeping me from slipping entirely into unconsciousness. My body was an unwelcome burden, numb and unresponsive as it was slung over his massive shoulder. I felt the stickiness of dried mud and blood crusting on my skin, and the damp chill of the tunnels was starting to seep into my bones. But even as my physical form failed, my awareness through the symbiotic bond was acute. almost blindingly intense. It wasn't that I was regaining my magic, it was that I was feeling his perception of the world, magnified and stabilized by my connection to him. We were moving deeper into the labyrinth, past areas of the maintenance tunnels I didn't recognize. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and mildew, a suffocating sweetness that felt heavy in my lungs, but I wasn't experiencing the overwhelming sensory overload that usually crippled him. Instead, through the bond, I felt how my presence acted as a grounding rod. I could feel him mapping the environment through a constant feedback loop. He wasn't seeing the blackness as I once did. He was perceiving gradients of density, thermal fluctuations, and minute vibrations. As his heavy boots struck the wet concrete, I felt the micro vibrations travel up through his frame into mine. I processed how his mind interpreted these echoes, identifying the solid concrete walls as impenetrable barriers and the open spaces as subtle shifts in air resistance. He navigated effortlessly, making sharp turns, stepping over debris, and ducking under rusting pipes. I felt the smooth confidence of his movements, fueled by the clarity I was providing him. It was terrifying to realize that I was now the indispensable component of his navigation, even as I was completely powerless in any other capacity. I felt his intense focus. He wasn't just walking, he was listening to the language of the subterranean world, filtered and clarified by my stabilizing influence. My role had shifted from simply being siphoned of energy to actively stabilizing his entire sensory input array. Occasionally, I would feel a brief spike of fatigue wash over him, a fleeting whisper of the exhaustion he was fighting. It would temporarily cloud his perceptual map. But the moment his contact with me intensified, his grip on my thigh tightening, I felt the map snap back into sharp, clear focus. I was his tether. Without me, he would be lost in a deafening, terrifying storm of sensory static. With me, he was the master of this pitch-black environment. We covered considerable distance. The air eventually became slightly less stagnant, signaling we were approaching a ventilated area or perhaps an older, abandoned section of the subterranean network. He finally slowed his pace, his breathing a harsh rattle in the darkness. He stopped in a seemingly arbitrary location, but through the bond, I felt him sensing a structural anomaly. It was a maintenance access panel, hidden behind a mess of corroded ventilation machinery leading to an old, unused pump station. He reached out and forced the heavy metal door open with a groan of protesting metal. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind us. He finally eased me off his shoulder. I collapsed onto the relatively dry concrete floor, my legs completely buckling beneath me. I didn't have the strength to even catch my fall, my face smacking against the dusty, cold surface. I was utterly spent, physically paralyzed, and emotionally shattered. He slid down the wall beside me, his own exhaustion finally overriding his alpha endurance. I heard his heavy, rugged exhales, and I felt the wave of physical pain emanating from him now that he wasn't actively suppressing it to move. For a long time, we just lay there in the absolute darkness. We were symbionts, fused together in this terrifying interdependence. He needed me to make sense of the world, and I needed him to survive it. Our hatred was still there, but it was now overshadowed by the brutal, undeniable fact that we were inseparable. The darkness in the pump station was complete, a velvet tomb where my physical self was slowly disintegrating. I was a consciousness trapped in a cage of numb flesh, existing only as a parasite on Damien's sensory feed. Through the link, I processed his desperation. He had bound his wound, siphoned my energy to keep his heart beating and his senses sharp, but it wasn't enough. The feedback loop was stabilizing him, but he was still dangerously weak, and I was fading faster than he could utilize the power. He needed a deeper conduit. We needed to be fused, not just touching. I felt the decision harden in his mind before I understood it. Through the connection, I perceived the heat signature of his own hand moving toward my waist. My body, paralyzed, offered no resistance as he dragged my sodden tunic upward, exposing my torso to the damp, chill air that felt like fire against my oversensitive nerve endings through his perception. I wanted to recoil, to scream, to raise the last of my defenses, but there were no defenses left. I had surrendered. He moved between my legs. I felt his immense weight shift, the groan of pain vibrating through the link as he adjusted his shredded shoulder. Through his enhanced sight, my splayed, pale legs were distinct gradients of heat against the cold concrete. There was no violence this time, no brutal assertion of dominance. There was only a grim, consuming necessity. He gripped my thighs with his functional right hand, lifting me slightly. I felt the shock of his entry. Through the bond, I felt the searing friction and the intense heat of his skin against my numb flesh, processed with a clarity that was overwhelming. He paused. Through the link, I felt his sharp, panting breath. I felt the wave of pleasure that crashed over his heightened senses, a raw, powerful thrumming that I experienced as if it were my own. And then he thrust. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he drove himself deep, seeking the very core of me. I gasped, the sound a dry rattle in the silence. It wasn't pain exactly. It was a terrifying, invasive intimacy. Through the symbiotic connection, I felt him inside me. I felt the intricate texture of my own body through his heightened, prickling senses. I felt the friction, the heat, the profound biological lock. The siphoning increased to a deafening roar. Every deep, deliberate thrust was a powerful pump, dredging the last embers of my fey energy from my marrow. Slowly, inexorably, he pulled back, only to drive deep again. With every slow movement, the energy transfer deepened. He was recharging, his thermal signature brightening, his erratic heartbeat stabilizing into a powerful thrum. I was being hollowed out, but simultaneously I was being flooded by his physical reality. I felt his sweat dripping onto my skin, processed through his thermal sensors. I felt the immense strain in his muscles, the pounding in his chest. For a moment, in that absolute darkness, our identities dissolved. There was no alpha wolf and captive fae. There was only the singular, symbiotic circuit. My energy, his force, my stillness, his movement. It was slow, deliberate. Each thrust was an eternity of shared, invasive sensation. I felt his physical pleasure peak, a brilliant explosion of energy that radiated through the link, jarring my fractured consciousness. Simultaneously, I felt my last reserve of fey magic flare in response, a final gift, or perhaps a final curse, surrendered to him. My core, the very source of my power, gave way, pouring everything into the connection. He let out a low, guttural growl, his voice cracking. He collapsed onto me, his weight immense, his forehead pressing against mine, his heartbeat pounding like a war drum against my chest. Through the stabilizing link, I felt the immediate change. He was grounded. The world through his eyes was no longer a terrifying storm of static. It was clear, precise. I lay beneath him, utterly spent, my vision a complete void. I was hollowed out, my magic gone, my identity surrendered to the cage. He was breathing heavily, his skin hot, damp, and alive. The siphoning slowed, settling into a steady, pulsing draw that maintained the connection. He needed me to see the world. I needed him to breathe. We lay in the crushing silence of the pump station, bound together in a terrifying physical intimacy that went far deeper than a mated mark. We had felt each other in a way few ever would, and I had never hated him more, even as I needed his proximity, his very scent, to keep the darkness from claiming me completely. The heavy, post-coital silence that followed was visceral, a raw and humid stillness that clung to the grimy air of the pump station. Damien's immense weight was still a crushing presence on top of me, but the frantic, desperate energy had evaporated, replaced by a dull, pulsing ache. Through the symbiotic tether, the world through his perception was no longer a fractured, terrifying mosaic of static. It was calm, stabilized. He lay with his face buried in the crook of my neck, his harsh, rugged exhales hot against my skin, sending phantom shivers through a body that was otherwise entirely inert. I was hollowed out, paralyzed. Every drop of my fey energy, every ember of my identity had been siphoned to fuel this monstrous interdependence. But I wasn't dead. I was suspended in the cage of our connection, forced to feel the deep thrum of his physical satisfaction and the raw power returning to his frame. It was a violation that went far deeper than the physical act, a complete colonization of my being. He finally shifted, pushing himself up off me with a groan that vibrated through the link, jarring my fractured awareness. I was left exposed on the cold, gritty concrete, my sodden, mud-encrusted tunic twisted around my waist. I didn't have the strength to raise my head, to adjust my clothing, or even to spit the dust from my mouth. I saw him. Through his perception, magnified and prioritized through the bond, I saw him standing over me. The tall, broad-shouldered alpha, no longer fumbling or disoriented. His chest was heaving, covered in a sheen of sweat and the dried blood of others, his dark eyes, unveiled, piercing, and terrifyingly functional, staring down at me. He didn't wear the blindfold. Through the link, I felt his overwhelming awe and horror as his gaze catalogued my form, the unassuming fey girl, broken and pale against the industrial decay. I felt his focus narrow, the sheer intensity of his sight cataloging every imperfection, every bruise with obsessive detail. He wasn't just looking at me. He was seeing the source of his new reality. The silence grew heavy, charged with all the things we couldn't say. He looked at his own scarred hands, turning them over, witnessing the grit on his skin, the texture of his gloves. "It's over," he rasped, his voice rough and gravelly, sounding foreign to my ears without the filter of his former disoriented perception. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He grabbed his torn clothes, pulling his tunic back on with his right arm. Through the bond, I felt the sharp, stinging protest of the deep claw wound in his left shoulder as he maneuvered, but he ignored it with the callous endurance of a warrior. The siphoning had already accelerated his healing. The wound was no longer a life threat, just an aggravation. The dynamics were shifting, brutal and undeniable. At the estate, I had been the toxic burden, the poisoned chalice the council thought would break him. In the slums, I had been his shield and artillery, expending my magic to save his life. But now, in the subterranean dark, the symbiosis was fixed. I was the battery, the essential stabilizer he required to navigate this new-sighted world. He was the force, the guardian, and the master of our physical survival. He didn't ask permission. He stooped down, scooping me up again. The immediate invasive contact was a shock. My body, sensitized and raw from the intimacy, recoiled in spirit, even as my physical form offered no resistance. The connection pulsed violently, and I felt the low, seductive current of his vital force surging into me. It was a trickle charge that stopped my violent shivering, grounding my consciousness from dissolving into the final darkness. I needed his proximity. The realization was more nauseating than the sex had been. "My glamour," I managed to whisper, the word a dry hiss in the silence, barely audible over the dull ache in my chest. It was the only defense I had left, the psychic shroud masking our distinct scent from the tracker wolves. "Hold it," he commanded. Not a request, but an alpha's order backed by the full weight of our shared survival. He kicked open the maintenance door he had forced earlier. The screech of protesting metal echoed through the pump station. We stepped back into the network of maintenance tunnels. The transition was jarring. Through the tether, the damp tunnels were a detailed, sensory-rich map of shadows, grimy pipes, and vibrational echoes of the city overhead. He moved with fluid, sighted confidence, navigating obstacles he would have once stumbled over. I was a passive burden, my head lulled against his shoulder, listening to the strong, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat, the only thing that felt real in the suffocating blackness. My glamour was fading, flickering like a guttering candle, but I knew I had to maintain it, a final, fragile barrier between us and the wolves still hunting in the dark. I woke not to the sensation of concrete, but to a terrifying, luxurious softness. It was the dust-sheeted mattress in the forgotten penthouse we had collapsed upon. For a moment, disoriented by the pale morning light filtering through dirt-encrusted windows, I thought I was back in the high hall of the summer court. Then the weight settled on me. Damien's arm was a heavy iron bar across my waist, pinning me to his massive naked chest. Our legs were intricately woven, a tangle of limbs that made it impossible to tell where I ended and he began. The adrenaline of the previous night, the desperate raw coupling that had been less about pleasure and more about a mutual, fierce reclaiming of our existence, had evaporated. In its place was a visceral, terrifying vulnerability. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the deep, resonant rhythm of his sleep. I looked at him, really looked at him, in the natural light. There was no blindfold to hide behind. His face, usually set in a grim mask of concentration or fury, was softened by sleep. I traced the rugged line of his jaw, the harsh scar that marred his cheek, the thick sweep of his dark lashes. Through the permanent, pulsing tether between us, I felt his subconscious state. It wasn't the chaotic storm of a broken beast anymore. It was calm, grounded, and terrifyingly possessive. He shifted, a low rumble vibrated in his chest, and his grip around my waist tightened, pulling me flush against his hard angles. He didn't wake, but the action was instinctive. Ownership. The reality of what we had done, of what we were now, crashed over me. This was no longer just a strategic alliance of a poisoned chalice and a broken alpha. The intense intimacy of the night before had forged something new, something raw and unbreakable. We belonged to each other now, bound by blood, magic, and a physical need that made my stomach clench in fear. I, highborn fae, trained for espionage and assassination, was entangled with the very monster I had been sent to destabilize. And I didn't hate him. The realization was more paralyzing than any venom. I hated what he was, what his pack represented, but him. I touched the scar on his shoulder, the one that was rapidly knitting together thanks to the energy transfer. I closed my eyes, trying to compartmentalize, to find the cold, calculating agent I used to be. That's when I felt it. It was faint, a psychic needle pricking the back of my mind. It was cold, elegant, and instantly recognizable. The summer court. My superiors. They knew I had gone rogue. They were reaching out, trying to reestablish the psychic leash that had been severed when I dropped my glamour and embraced Damien. Protocol Alpha 6 meant neutralize and extract. They wanted me to kill Damien and return for reassessment. The pull was seductive, offering the familiar, cold logic of my old life. I looked back at Damien. He was waking up. I felt his consciousness surface through the bond, bright and focused. He opened his eyes, those dark, piercing, seeing eyes, and looked directly into mine. Through the link, I felt the sheer, overwhelming wave of protective, raw possessiveness that crested in him when he saw me. He didn't see an agent. He saw his mate, his anchor, the other half of himself. I reached out spiritually and severed the psychic thread from the summer court. I ignored the command. I didn't even give them acknowledgement. The connection to them died with a cold, distant snap. Damien smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his rugged face. He kissed my forehead, a lingering, tender gesture that sealed the decision. "Good morning," he rasped, his voice rough with sleep. I pulled myself free of his grasp, though the ache in my body protested, and sat up, wrapping the dust sheet around myself. The vulnerability was still there, but it was being replaced by a cold resolve. "We can't keep running, Damien," I said, my voice steady, the agent returning, but this time with a different mission. He sat up beside me, the sheets pooling at his waist, his muscular torso bare and powerful. "No. The trackers will find us eventually. Marcus will never stop." "I know." "We have to go back," I stated, looking at him. "To survive, we have to finish it." He didn't hesitate. He looked at his own hands, then at me, the strategic mind of an alpha warrior engaging. "We go back. We burn Marcus out." The vulnerability of the morning after solidified into a partnership of war. We had found grounding in each other, a restorative intimacy that had healed our immediate wounds, but now we had to turn that power outward. "I have a plan," I said, a dangerous light igniting in my eyes. "But it requires us to break the estate's foundation, not just kill the alpha." Damien leaned back against the dusty headboard, watching me with newfound respectful clarity. "Tell me."
The dust motes dancing in the shafts of morning light filtering through the grimy windows of the penthouse were not merely specks of debris. They were a revelation. They were vibrant kinetic energy made visible, a swirling universe that I had been blind to for 2 decades. 20 years. I stood by the window, my bare chest pressing against the cold pane, looking down at the strange concrete jungle of the human city. Through her gift, the stabilizing tether of fey magic humming between Irene and me. The world was clear, crisp, precise. The previous 20 years had been a dark symphony of vibrations, thermal differentials, and smells. It had been an existence defined by proximity and limitation. I had believed myself powerful, an alpha who navigated the dark, but looking at the distant sprawling skyline, I realized I had been a child playing with shadows. A child playing precisely the game Marcus had written for me. The realization settled in my chest, heavy and cold as a tombstone. The history I had been fed by the elders. The comforting narrative that the plague had stolen my sight but forged me into a better, more resilient leader was a monstrous lie. Marcus hadn't pitied me. He hadn't been protecting me. He had been neutralizing me. My father had been the alpha. I was his heir. In a society ruled by brute force and instinct, a blind alpha was an aberration, a placeholder that could be controlled. If I had been born sighted, I would have challenged Marcus the moment my wolf matured. He knew it. So the Fey Plague was invented, a convenient mystical scapegoat, and they had managed me, contained my fury within acceptable parameters, using me as their mindless boogeyman to keep the outer ring and the human cattle terrified. They had blindfolded me, not just to control my sensory feed, but to symbolize my total submission to their reality. And I had accepted it. I felt a low, vibrating growl build deep in my chest, not the hot, reactive fury that usually drove the wolf, but something colder, deeper, a calculated, righteous rage. Marcus's power was a construct of lies, and I was the physical proof of that architecture of deceit. A sighted, powerful Damien was his absolute nightmare. I turned back to the room. Irene was gone from the dust-sheeted mattress, leaving only the indent of her body and the lingering, sweet, sharp scent of her, the smell that was now my anchor. I followed the sensory trails, the physical scent, the residual heat, and, most importantly, the humming psychic trail through our bond. I found her in the adjacent grand ballroom. The room was a massive, decaying expanse of crystal chandeliers draped in dust sheets and parquet flooring warped by time. She was near a massive gilded mirror looking at her reflection. Through the link I felt her self-assessment. Cold, pragmatic. She was cataloging her exhaustion, the physical toll of her depleted magic, the grim reality of our situation. She saw an unassuming fey girl in rags. I saw a queen standing in the ruins of a human empire. When she heard me enter, she turned. Through my eyes, I saw her not as the blurry thermal ghost she used to be, but with an agonizing, sharp clarity. The fine texture of her dark skin, the defensive set of her jaw, the way the light caught in the copper strands of her braided hair. The physical impact was almost overwhelming, a cascade of sensory input that jarred my mind. Sight didn't just give me vision, it amplified everything. Through our bond, she felt my focus on her. Her eyes, the colors of a stormy sea, narrowed. The strategic alliance we had forged, the restorative intimacy of the previous night was still present, but the raw reality of the war we were about to start was descending. "We go back," I said. My voice was a gravelly rumble resonating powerfully in the empty ballroom. It was the voice of the Alpha who had finally opened his eyes. Irene didn't look back at the mirror, her gaze locked with mine, steady and unwavering. "Yes, we go back." The admission was simple, but it carried the weight of a death sentence for one of us, perhaps both. We weren't just fugitives anymore, we were a revolution. I started to move through the ballroom, cataloging the space as a strategic asset. My blindness had forced me to memorize geography by texture and echo. Now, sight allowed me to integrate that knowledge with distance and cover. I was mentally rebuilding the estate from the inside out, applying this new perspective to the layout I knew like the back of my hand. "They won't expect me sighted," I mused, the words more for myself than her. "They think I'm still a monster in the dark." "They don't know anything, Damien," Irene said, moving towards me. Through the bond I felt her magic pulsing, low and erratic, but present. "They are afraid of you." That fear made them sloppy, but the connection, it's doing more than just stabilizing your vision, isn't it? I stopped, turning fully to face her. "Explain." She walked around me, assessing me with an intelligence that went far beyond mere tactics. "I am a catalyst for you. When we connect, especially like that, my highborn magic acts as a psychic amplifier, your alpha status, your ability to feel and direct the pack. It's dormant, atrophied by years of isolation and Marcus's suppression. But the magic, it's like grounding a circuit. It's allowing your intrinsic power to resonate at a frequency you haven't felt before." I pushed my senses outwards, trying to understand what she meant. For my entire life, the pack link had been a low-frequency hum, a buzz of background emotions, hierarchies, and needs. It had been useful for coordination during a hunt, but it was essentially static. Now, as I reached, it was different. Through the stabilizing power of our bond, I didn't just feel the abstract status of the pack. I felt their resonance. I could feel Marcus miles away at the central castle, a concentrated, poisonous knot of ambition and cold, rational fear. I felt Celine, his mate, my mate, the woman who had been forced on me as a humiliation, a chaotic spiral of vanity and venom currently vibrating with an elitist fury. But the trackers, I felt them most clearly. They were moving through the city below, a lean, fast response unit sent by Marcus. Their emotions were a distinct pulsing track through the link: anticipation, predatory focus, and the underlying dread of failing the council. I could feel their location, triangulating them not by scent or sound, but by their psychic, emotional footprint. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The pack link, the true essence of an alpha, was not about communication or hierarchy. It was empathy and authority made physical. It was the ability to see the soul of the pack and shape it to your will. And through Irene, I could see it all. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. I looked at Irene, the unassuming woman who had broken my cage by locking herself in with me. A catalyst, I repeated. Through you, I can feel their very intent. The tracking unit was moving closer to the warehouse district below the penthouse. They weren't just searching randomly. Marcus had given them the emotional signature of our escape, our shared trauma. They were tracking the echo of our pain. I moved to the window again, watching the streets below. I didn't see human activity now. I saw terrain. I saw bottlenecks, ambush points, and escape routes. Sight gave me the tactical overview my blindness had denied me. "They're coming," I said. My tone was conversational, devoid of panic. Panic was a waste of energy. Strategy was what we needed. I reached out through the amplifier of our bond, not to fight, but to manipulate. I didn't project my will. That required pack-wide acceptance, and I was still the broken monster in their eyes. Instead, I manipulated their resonance. The trackers were focused on the echo of my rage and Irene's fear. They expected a desperate, injured, reactive beast. I psychically pushed a wash of phantom energy into the link, a resonance of exhaustion, disorientation, and vulnerability. I made the target signature weaker. Through the tether, I felt Irene gasp as I manipulated the psychic currents. "You're masking us." "I'm giving them the target they expect," I replied. "Let them get comfortable in their superiority." The plan that was forming wasn't just about killing Marcus, it was about dismantling him. Irene was right. The estate relied on the outer ring, the human slaves, for labor, but more importantly for psychological justification. The weaker wolves felt strong only by comparison to the humans they were allowed to torment. Marcus's entire rule was built on this artificial hierarchy of oppression, enforced by the council's elite guards and my own terrifying reputation. "Your mission," I said, looking at her. "You were sent to incite a civil war, to destabilize the internal dynamics." "To make you kill each other, yes," she confirmed, her tone professionally detached. "That mission is a joke now," I stated, walking back towards her. "Because you aren't just destabilizing the status quo. You are enabling me to destroy the foundation." I grabbed her shoulders, our physical contact surging the connection, grounding us both. Through the link, I felt her sudden, sharp spike of awareness, a reciprocal flow of my alpha energy stabilizing her own depleted reserves. Marcus has controlled the pack through the lie that I was necessary, a beast they needed to tolerate because I was the boogeyman that kept the outer ring docile, I explained. The slaves are the labor, but they are also the distraction. If the humans rebel, the wolves have to unify to contain them, and Marcus's authority is absolute in a crisis. "So," she said, her sea storm eyes widening with understanding, "we don't just kill him. If we just kill him, the pack will fracture, yes, but another tyrant will eventually rise from the council. The humans will remain chained." "Exactly," I said. A cold, strategic clarity was settling over me. Sight didn't just show me the world, it showed me the patterns of power. To break Marcus, we cannot just kill him. We have to break the system that upholds him. I was mentally overlaying the tactical layout I knew from decades of being the boogeyman with the strategic assessment of a sighted leader. "The outer ring is flammable," she added, mirroring my strategic shift. Through the bond, I felt her analytical mind engaging. You saw the ruins in Book 1. They rely on the slaves for everything, but they fear them. That fear is Marcus's power. My father was loved, I stated, the memory a ghost of sound and thermal prints. He didn't rule through fear, he ruled through the pack link, through mutual need. Marcus broke that link. He replaced empathy with authority, and he used me as the whip. I pushed my senses outwards again, feeling the trackers. They were in the streets directly below the building now. They were cautious, checking ambush points, their internal focus a quiet, confident, predatory buzz. They didn't see the true threat. They only saw what I allowed them to feel, the weak, disoriented fugitives they expected. The catalyst of Irene's magic wasn't just giving me sight, it was unlocking my full potential, restoring the capabilities Marcus had tried to breed out of me. I was an alpha without a pack right now, yes, but through this bond I was the most dangerous creature the Stone River pack had ever produced. We cannot keep running, I reiterated, my hands still on her shoulders, the tether humming with our shared strategic intent. The dynamic has to shift, Irene. In Book 1 I was the poisoned chalice. The thing meant to destroy me. In the slums I was a weapon you needed to recharge, but here, now, we are something else. Through the bond I felt her agreement, not submission, partnership, the mutual raw understanding we had forged in the dust of the penthouse. We belonged to each other now, a terrifying interdependence that Marcus couldn't comprehend. We go back to the estate, I said, my gaze locked with hers. The light in the ballroom seemed to brighten, emphasizing the clarity of my sight. We use the ruins of the slums as our entry point. Marcus will be looking for us at the perimeter gates or the trade routes. He won't expect us to return to the heart of the destruction we caused. Tactically sound, she agreed, but once we are in, we split up, I commanded. It was an order, not a suggestion, the alpha in me taking control. Your mission isn't assassination, not anymore. You are a high-born fae. You can communicate, and with the boost our bond provides, you can connect. I moved away from her, the plan solidifying. The humans in the outer ring, they're cowed, terrified. They have been broken by generations of conditioning. But they outnumber the wolves, Irene, by a factor of 10. Marcus keeps them docile through the Council's elite guards and the constant threat of me. I looked out the window one last time. The trackers were entering the parking garage. I felt their anticipation spike. They thought they had cornered the weak, blind monster and the used-up fae girl. I will go to the council chamber, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. I will confront Marcus. I will dismantle his authority physically and psychologically in front of his guards. A sighted, powerful Damien standing in the throne room will shatter their belief in Marcus's control. And while you do that, she asked, her tone sharp with interest. You, I said, pointing a finger at her, you are highborn. Your magic isn't just about fire, Irene. You can connect psychically on a grand scale. You go to the vast underground barracks where the slaves are penned at night. The powder keg. Through the bond, I felt her start, the implication of my command settling. Our bond isn't just a catalyst for sight or for me, I said, turning fully back to her. It's a psychic amplifier for both of us. My alpha will combined with your fae power. You will connect with thousands of minds. You can't just talk to them, you can project intent, you can break their conditioning. The plan was audacious, reckless, and the only way we could win. You go to the barracks, I repeated, the full weight of the alpha will behind the command. You prepare the humans. You break the psychological chains that keep them trapped. You wait for my signal. The trackers were in the elevator. I felt their predatory confidence peak. They thought they were the hunters. I felt Irene process the plan through the bond. The initial fear was replaced by a cool, calculating acceptance. She was the one who had dropped her glamour and unleashed full fae power to create an escape, She wasn't afraid of destruction. She was an agent of destabilization, and I was giving her the ultimate mission. "I understand," she said. Her sea-storm eyes were fierce, reflecting the dangerous light in mine. The elevator arrived. The doors chimed, and I heard the low, guttural growls of the tracking unit as they fanned out into the penthouse foyer. I didn't turn around. I didn't rush to fight. Sight had given me clarity. Tactics had given me confidence. Through the bond, I simply released the dampening wash of phantom vulnerability I had been maintaining. I psychically dropped the target. Instantly, through the link, I felt the tracker's confidence disintegrate into a tidal wave of paralyzing shock. The weak, vulnerable resonance they expected was replaced by a surge of raw, powerful alpha will and the bright, searing energy of high-born magic. They were trapped in the foyer of a building they had thought was a refuge, now exposed to the full amplifying force of the true alpha and his catalyst. They didn't howl a challenge. They whimpered. I looked at Irene, the only other creature in the universe who truly saw me, and who had chosen to stand with me. We had felt each other raw and mutual in the dust of our refuge. The restorative intimacy of that night had given us the strength to face this moment. The transition from survival to revolution was complete. I was no longer the blind monster, and she was no longer the captive spy. We were the architects of a new dawn. "We have to go back," I said, the words no longer a decision but an inevitability. "To survive, we finish it." Irene nodded, her eyes fierce. "Finish it." I finally turned to face the foyer. Sight showed me the 4 trackers, lean, efficient killers paralyzed in the hallway. They weren't looking at a monster in the dark. They were staring with total, devastating clarity at the true alpha. The fight would be brutal, silent, and decisive. The opening salvo of a war that would burn the estate to the ground. And through the connection that bound me to Irene, I had never been more powerful, never more certain, and never more ready to claim the pyre that was mine by right.
The metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of burnt ozone from the kinetic blast I'd used to slam the last tracker into the elevator shaft hung heavy in the penthouse air. It was a brutal, efficient slaughter. Through our bond, I felt Damien's satisfaction, not the chaotic bloodlust of the beast he used to be, but the cold, calculated arithmetic of a warrior clearing obstacles. He stood amidst the bodies, chest heaving, his dark eyes, unveiled and piercing, sweeping the room. Sight had given him lethality, but the bond had given him dominion. I leaned against the warped doorframe of the ballroom, my body trembling with reaction. The energy I had channeled to amplify his psychic ambush and fuel my own defensive blast had stripped me raw. I was a hollowed-out shell, the summer court's elegant spy reduced to a sputtering candle. Through the tether, Damien felt my collapse. He turned, the predatory focus of the hunt vanishing, replaced by that terrifying, absolute possessiveness that had rooted itself in him since the morning after. He was across the room in 3 strides. "Irene!" He didn't catch me. He gathered me. He scooped me into his massive arms, ignoring the fresh claw marks across his own bicep from the tracker fight. The moment our flesh connected, the symbiosis slammed into place with bruising force. It was like grounding a lightning rod. The low-frequency, vital life force that was Damien, the raw, resonant vibration of the true alpha, surged into me. My head fell against his shoulder. My body, which had been dissolving into a cold, gray haze, reassembled around that core of borrowed heat. I despised the dependency, hated that my very existence now relied on proximity to this apex predator, but the pragmatic agent within me knew it was our only chance. He carried me back to the mattress. He sat, leaning against the dusty headboard, pulling me into the center of his lap, wrapping himself around me like a shield. He didn't speak. He just held me, channeling his vitality into my starved system. I felt the summer court link again. Faint. Cold. I ignored it. The distant snap of severing the connection again was easier this time. I looked up at Damien, focusing on the rough texture of his jaw, the smell of cedar and old blood. "Your strategy," I rasped, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "You want to dismantle the system, not just kill the tyrant." He looked down at me, his eyes dark pools, reflecting the light of a new, dangerous understanding. Marcus rules through fear. He creates monsters to justify his chains. I was the biggest monster. And the outer ring is the battery that fuels that fear, I stated, the plan solidifying in my mind, written in the cold logic of espionage. I spent weeks in those slums, Damien. Before you claimed me, I saw it. I leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his physical presence to fuel my mental assessment. The estate's economy relies 100% on human slave labor. They mine the Stone River, they farm the toxic fields, they clean the castle, they are the entertainment and the punching bags. The wolves get fat on their labor, Damien rumbled, his grip tightening. Through the link, I felt his disgust, his rage at being used as the whip for 20 years. Yes, but it's more than labor, I explained. I shifted, forcing my mind to work despite the seductive pull of physical recovery. The hierarchy of the Stone River Pack is predicated on oppression. The weaker wolves, the omegas and low-ranking enforcers, they need the humans. Being allowed to dominate, abuse, and degrade the cattle is what makes them feel superior. It satisfies the pack urge for dominance when they are too weak to challenge the chain of command above them. I looked at his scarred hands, the hands of a warrior who had been blind to the true battlefield. If you remove the slaves, Damien, the entire psychological infrastructure of the pack collapses. The low ranks will lose their outlet. The mid-ranks will lose their labor. The council will lose their luxury. Fear will be replaced by internal chaos. Through the bond, I felt him process the assessment. He wasn't just a warrior anymore. He was an alpha learning strategy. He saw the pattern. We don't go to the perimeter gates, he said, his strategic mind engaging. Marcus will have armored the entry points. He expects us to fight our way out. He doesn't expect us to fight our way in, I confirmed. A dangerous thrill, the first ember of genuine purpose I'd felt since being assigned this doomed mission, ignited in my chest. We use the ruins of the slums. They're a burnt-out wasteland, Irene. Miles of scorched earth. There is no cover. And that is exactly why he won't expect it, I countered. The garrison is occupied trying to round up the surviving humans and enforce martial law in the inner ring. The slums are a graveyard, a blind spot. I looked at him, emphasizing my point. We infiltrate through the ashes of the homes I burned, the very place our revolution started. I felt his agreement, a surge of calculated, cold purpose through the tether. He respected the audacity of the plan. The plan only works, I said, my voice dropping, if we play our roles that Marcus can't predict. He waited. You are the true alpha. Sight has given you clarity. The bond has amplified your dormant connection to the pack link. You can feel them, Damien. You felt the trackers. I can, he confirmed, his jaw tightened. I can feel the entire disease network, a buzz of fear and ambition. You go to the council chambers, I commanded, mirroring the authority he had shown the morning after. You confront Marcus directly in the throne room, surrounded by his council and his guards, a sighted, powerful Damien, standing in the heart of his kingdom. That alone will shatter the foundation of his lie. If you kill him quickly, he's a martyr to his system. If you dismantle him, you break the council's belief that they can control the wolf. And you? He asked. Through the link, I felt a spike of immediate protective anxiety. He didn't want to let me go. I am the battery, I stated. I pulled myself free of his embrace, though the sudden absence of his heat made my breath hitch. I sat facing him on the mattress, wrapped in a dust sheet, a pale, scarred fey woman who had once been an agent of chaos and was now becoming an architect of freedom. Our bond isn't just a catalyst for you, Damien. It works both ways. It amplifies my highborn magic. When we are close, when we connect. I paused, acknowledging the raw intimacy that was the foundation of this power. It surges my potential. I am not a catalyst for fire, Irene, he said, a possessive growl in his tone. No, you are the catalyst for will, I corrected. Highborn Fae are empathy mages. We are trained to infiltrate, to manipulate, to blend. We are conduits. My fire is a crude survival mechanism I developed when I was cut off from my ley lines. I looked at my hands, visualizing the true nature of my power. With the amplify of your alpha will, Damien, I can do more than burn. I can connect, on a mass scale. I leaned forward, my gaze fierce. You go to Marcus. I go to the vast underground barracks where the slaves are penned at night. Thousands of them, Damien. Terrified, broken, conditioned to obey through generations of brutality. Through the bond, I felt his horror as he understood the implication. I will infiltrate the barracks, I continued. With the boost our bond provides, I won't just talk to them. I will connect psychically with thousands of minds simultaneously. I am a conduit of shared trauma, Damien. I know their pain. I was one of them. It will burn you out, he grated, his worry a heavy weight in the tether. It will, I admitted calmly. The agent in me accepted the cost. But if I succeed, I will prime the powder keg. I will link with them. I will break the psychological chains of their conditioning. I will unite thousands of desperate souls into a single entity waiting for a spark. The plan was binary, strategy and infiltration, a two-pronged attack that Marcus, in his elitist arrogance and fear of a blind monster, could never have prepared for. We infiltrate via the slums, I stated, the finality of a tactical decision sealing the chapter. We split up once inside the main castle. You, the king reclaiming his throne, me, the spark in the dark. Damien stared at me. Through his perception, I saw the Fey girl, pale and exhausted, but illuminated by a terrifying bright intelligence. Through the bond, I felt his visceral struggle, his brute instinct to lock me away to protect his mate, battling with the tactical clarity of an alpha who knew this was the only way to win. He finally nodded. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The slums, tonight. We spent the rest of the day in a taut professional stillness, a stark contrast to the explosive intimacy of Book 1. We prepared our gear, scavenged knives, dark tunics from the penthouse closets. We didn't talk, we didn't need to. The tether relayed everything, the shared resolve, the tactical planning, and the heavy, underlying thread of mutual need. Night fell over the human city and we moved like shadows. The transition from the concrete city to the estate grounds was visceral. We used a maintenance tunnel for a metro line that ran near the outer perimeter fence. Damien tore a section of the rusted barrier open with contemptuous ease, the brute force of his new life amplified by his restored sight. We stepped through, not into a jungle, but into a graveyard. The slums were a profound wasteland of white ash and twisted, molten metal. Book 1's firestorm had been absolute. Through my perception, it was a hollow, empty echo of my home. Through his, it was a detailed, three-dimensional landscape of tactical challenges. We didn't need scent now, we had visibility. We moved through the charred remains of shanties that had once housed entire generations. It was eerily silent, devoid of the sounds of life, the low moans, the crying children. I can feel them, Damien whispered, his voice a gravelly rumble. He wasn't talking about scent, he was reaching out with the amplified pack link. The garrison? They are in the inner ring. They are distracted. Fear of us has made them withdraw to the center. Just as we planned, I breathed. The main castle, a brutalist monument of Stone River granite, loomed ahead, dark and imposing against the night sky. In Book 1, this place had been my prison. Tonight, it was the target. We reached the base of the central tower. We looked at each other, the last moment of quiet. Through the tether, the connection was a blazing, humming cable of shared purpose, restorative intimacy, and raw, mutual dependency. The roles were fixed. Finish it, Damien, I said, my hand on his chest, feeling the powerful rhythm of his heartbeat, the life force that was my sustenance. Break the chains, Irene, he commanded, the full weight of the true alpha behind the order. He turned, the powerful warrior ascending to confront his usurper. I slipped into the maintenance shadows of the base, the spider agent returning to the dark network of the castle, heading towards the deep underground barracks. The battery was engaged, the strategy was in motion, and the Stone River estate was about to learn that the only thing more dangerous than a blind monster was a monster who had finally opened his eyes, and the woman who loved him enough to burn the world down with him.
The air in the maintenance shaft was stale, smelling of rust, rodent droppings, and the ancient cold scent of the stone that formed the foundation of the estate. But to my newly opened eyes, it was a terrifyingly vibrant tableau. I could see the varied textures of the rough-hewn rock, the glint of condensation on copper pipes, the intricate dusty patterns of spider webs that I had only ever felt snap against my face. 20 years I had navigated this fortress in absolute darkness, building a mental map based on echo, temperature, and smell. Now the visual overlay was jarring, contradicting my deeply ingrained spatial awareness. It made me feel off balance, raw, and the separation from Irene made it worse. The moment she slipped away into the branching tunnel leading down toward the slave barracks, a physical ache had settled in my chest. our bond forged in the dust of the slums, solidified by the restorative, raw connection of the morning after, was not just a conduit for power. It was a psychic tether that had become essential to my stability. Through the link, I felt her receding presence. She was focused, the cold, pragmatic agent asserting control over her fear. But I also felt her exhaustion, the echo of how much she had drained herself to fuel my sight and keep the trackers off our scent. She was walking into the mouth of the beast, relying on nothing but her wits and a reservoir of power that was perilously low. The beast within me roared in protest, demanding I follow her, protect my mate, lock her away from the danger. But the alpha, the true alpha that had been awakened by her touch, knew better. This was strategy, this was war. I forced myself upwards, moving through the narrow, hidden stairwells that servants and high-ranking enforcers used to bypass the main halls. Sight made me faster, more precise, but it also made me angry. I looked at the walls I had touched for decades. They looked small, petty. The grand design that Marcus had preached, the necessity of the order, looked like what it was. A brutal, ugly construct of stone meant to contain a lie. I reached the level of the inner ring, the residential area for the pack elite and the council guards. The atmosphere here was dense, saturated with the oily scent of luxury and the sharp, coppery tang of recent brutality. Marcus was trying to re-establish control after our escape, and the smell of fear from the lower-ranking wolves was overwhelming. Through the amplified pack link, the true sense that Irene had unlocked, I could feel the entire network pulsating with anxiety. They knew the boogeyman was loose. They didn't know the boogeyman could see. I rounded a corner and came face to face with a patrol of 3 council enforcers. They were large, brutal wolves, the kind that Marcus handpicked for their lack of imagination and their eagerness to dominate the weak. They were talking in hushed, nervous tones about the hunt for us. In the past, I would have used scent and sound to gauge their positions, launching a reactive, sensory-driven assault. Now I saw the structural weaknesses in their stance. I saw the rhythm of their breathing, the minute twitches of their muscles that betrayed their intent. I saw their fear. They froze when they saw me. I stood at the end of the corridor, uncovered, my dark eyes direct and focused. They looked at the scarred wolf they knew only as a blind monster, and for a second their brains couldn't process the anomaly of my gaze. "Damien," one stammered, his hand going to the crude iron axe at his belt. "He's blind, he can't—" I didn't give him a chance to finish. I surged forward, the raw kinetic energy of my shift already beginning to alter my skeletal structure. I was silent, efficient. The wolf did not need to howl in the dark anymore. He could see his target. The first enforcer went down before he could draw his weapon. I brought my hand down, claws fully extended, tearing through the meat of his shoulder, severing the brachial artery in a visceral explosion of dark red blood that sprayed across the ancient stone walls. The sight of it, the shocking bright color of the fluid I had only ever smelled, sent a jolt of primal satisfaction through me. The other 2 reacted with panicked instinct, dropping their axes and beginning the agonizing, bone-snapping shift into their wolf forms. It was a tactical error born of terror. They were attempting a brute force solution against a target that had already transcended that level. I grabbed the second wolf mid-shift, his body elongated and vulnerable. I drove my knee into his chest, hearing the satisfying crunch of his sternum imploding. He collapsed, gurgling blood, his partially shifted face a mask of agony. The third wolf completed the shift, a snarling, large black beast. He lunged, aiming for my throat. I didn't dodge. I stepped inside his guard, grabbing him by the jaw and the ruff. Before I could apply the pressure to snap his neck, a massive, agonizing wash of cold, empty despair flooded through my bond with Irene. I froze. The brutal violence of my current moment entirely irrelevant. Irene. Deep below, in the black heart of the slave barracks, she had engaged her mission. She hadn't just touched the slaves' minds, she had fully opened herself up as a conduit. Through our tether, I was experiencing the reciprocal echo of her action. I felt the crushing, ancient weight of 1,000 souls who had been broken by generations of conditioning. I felt their hopelessness, their visceral terror of the council, their paralyzing belief in their own insignificance. It was a psychic tide of misery that threatened to swamp my own consciousness. Through that tide, I felt Irene's core, her light, her intelligence, her indomitable agent will starting to sputter. She was fighting a war of empathy against an ocean of despair, and she was drowning. The enforcer wolf, sensing my sudden distraction, lunged again, teeth snapping close to my face. My rage, previously focused on Marcus's lie, transformed. It became a molten, targeted energy dedicated to the preservation of my anchor. My mate was dying in the dark, priming a weapon I had ordered her to arm. I would not let her fail. I released the enforcer's jaw, grabbing his throat instead. I didn't just exert physical force, I channeled my own raw alpha will, the ability to command the pack link through my touch. I psychically bludgeoned the wolf with the simple, absolute truth of my authority. I made him feel the true alpha, not the boogeyman. His eyes widened, the predatory intelligence vanishing, replaced by total submissive, whimpering terror. He collapsed to the stone floor, shifting back to human form, shivering and defeated without me having to shed another drop of his blood. I left him there and ran. I no longer cared about stealth. I needed to reach Marcus. I needed to shatter the lie, not just for the pack, but to create the psychic shockwave that would give Irene the fuel she needed to succeed. I ascended to the grand hall level. I smelled the opulence before I saw it. Roasted meats, expensive wine, the scent of perfumes masking the underlying rot of the Stone River power structure. Through the link, I could feel the presence of the council in the chambers ahead. Marcus was there, a concentrated knot of cold ambition and growing paranoid fear. Celine was by his side, a vibrating signal of elitist venom and narcissism. The great hall doors, massive slabs of oak and iron, loomed ahead. They were guarded by 2 more elite enforcers. They drew their weapons when they saw me approaching, but they hesitated when they saw my eyes. I didn't slow down. I reached out through the tether, tapping into the stabilizing cold core of Irene's logic to filter my rage. I needed precision, not a bloodbath, for this final act. I pulled vitality from the air, from my own muscles, and slammed it through the connection to Irene. It was a raw, visceral exchange of life force, like bleeding into her. "Hold on," I commanded, not through speech but through the deep, ancient imperative of our shared soul. "Hold on, I am coming." Through the link, I felt her core stabilize, drawing greedily on my offered strength. The tide of despair below paused. I focused on the guards in front of me. I smiled, a terrifying expression that had never before been seen on my face. I didn't attack them. I simply walked forward, extending my presence, my alpha will, fully for the first time. I projected the truth. I was the leader, I was the heir, I was sighted, and I was absolute. Their conditioning warred with their instinct. They looked at the doors, at the law they were supposed to uphold, and then they looked at me. Sighted, true. They stepped aside, lowering their weapons, heads bowing in submissive acknowledgement. They were the first to acknowledge the change in leadership. I gripped the massive handles of the great hall doors. The restorative intimacy of Book 1, the fierce strategic partnership of the penthouse. It all coalesced into this moment. The transition from survival to revolution was complete. I was no longer the blind monster, and she was no longer the spy. We were the architects of a new dawn. I took a deep, steadying breath, maximizing my oxygen intake, preparing the wolf and the man for the confrontation. I let my true alpha presence, amplified by the bond with the highborn fae who loved me enough to burn the world for me, surge outwards. I let them feel the storm coming. I threw open the doors to the council chambers.
The air in the maintenance tunnel leading from the charred wasteland of the outer ring toward the main castle was slick with humidity, smelling of ancient rust, wet soot, and the metallic tang of dried blood that I carried on my own skin. We moved like ghosts, a symmetrical paradox of shadow and raw intent. Through the symbiotic tether binding us, I felt Damien's focus. A focused cold arithmetic that catalogued entry points, thermal currents, and the distant panicked heartbeats of the garrison. Sight had not just restored him, it had made him lethal, on a frequency the Stone River Pack could not comprehend. But I felt his anxiety too, a low vibrating thrum against my ribs that had nothing to do with the hunt, and everything to do with me. The connection was holding me together. Being away from the ley lines of the estate, combined with the explosive exertion of Book 1 and the subsequent constant state of stealth survival, had left my reserves dry. I was hollow, a beautiful, delicate shell, relying entirely on the trickle charge of raw vitality Damien was feeding me through our proximity. When his hand touched the small of my back to guide me, the influx of his vital life force was so sudden, so potently restorative, that I almost gasped. It stopped the gray haze from creeping in around the edges of my vision. It made me desire the very proximity I should logically despise. We reached the nexus, the heavy, iron-reinforced grate that separated the maintenance tunnels from the grand staircase level and the descent to the sinks. We stopped. The silence in the tunnel was profound, broken only by the sharp, metallic screeches of the structure cooling in the night air. Damien turned to me. Through my perception, his gaze, those dark, piercing eyes previously hidden behind a blindfold, was a physical weight. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The bond relayed the depth of his possessiveness, his terrifying instinct to lock me away from the danger ahead, to wrap himself around me and obliterate anything that threatened his anchor. But it also relayed his tactical respect. He knew this was the only way. I reached out, my hand touching the rough fabric covering his chest, feeling the powerful, rapid rhythm of his heartbeat. "Your role," I whispered, the word barely a dry hiss. "The throne," he grated, his voice dropping into a rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. He catalogued my exhausted state, his concern a physical ache in the link. He didn't want to let me go. "Hold the glamour, Irene. Feed off me. Hold." "The sinks," I replied, the strategic agent re-emerging from the haze of dependency. It was a final, raw acknowledgement of our roles in this new, terrifying symbiosis. At the estate, I was a poison chalice. In the slums, I was a weapon. But here, in the cold, dark underbelly of the fortress, we were equals in a devastating strategy. A two-pronged attack. The true alpha goes to the high tower to confront the usurper, to shatter the psychological foundation of Marcus's rule. The highborn Fae goes to the depths to arm the powder keg. I pulled myself free of his space, though the absence of his immediate heat made my skin break out in a cold sweat. The dynamic shifted from the intense, raw intimacy of the morning after to the cold calculation of war. He gripped the rusted latch of the grate. Even as a human, his strength was immense, fueled by the focus that sight had granted him. He turned the mechanism. The sound of metal screaming against metal was deafening in the narrow space. We both froze, listening. Above us, the chaos was already building. We could feel it through the amplified packlink, shouts, the heavy clatter of armored boots, the terrified whines of low-ranking wolves as the garrison realized the true nature of the intrusion. The signal was in motion. I gave Damien one final look. Through the bond, I felt the visceral pull, the urge to remain entangled in his strength. But I turned. "Split up," I commanded, the authority of my Fae lineage asserting control. I slipped through the shadows towards the narrow, wet spiral staircase that descended into the abyss of the sinks. The descent was an assault on the senses. The air grew progressively heavier, warmer, saturated with the coppery stink of old blood, the rot of unwashed bodies, and the sharp, nauseating scent of excrement. The dampness on the stone walls was green with algae and toxic runoff. This was where the foundation of Stone River lay, in the systematic, crushing degradation of the humans that fed it. My role was strategy and espionage and empathy. I had to merge with this misery. I reached the bottom, a massive cavern reinforced with iron and Stone River granite, packed with row after row of tiered cages. The humidity here was like a physical blow. The sounds were a low, constant murmur of hopeless suffering, moans, the dry rattle of coughs, the soft, defeated weeping of children. The presence of thousands of broken souls created a psychic field of despair that was so intense it almost neutralized the stabilization I was drawing from Damien. The gray haze threatened to overwhelm me. I forced myself into the shadows near the primary distribution platform, a raised iron grate over a waste channel, where the human guards, brutalized by their proximity to the wolves, administered discipline. I looked out at the thousands of tired, terrified eyes staring blankly at nothing, conditioned through generations of brutality to obey. They are waiting, I thought, a high, cold, fey logic cutting through the dependency. I closed my eyes, concentrating on the bond. I was too weak to perform magic, but I could connect. I had to drop my internal psychological barriers to become a massive, empathic satellite receiver. I needed Damien. I needed his alpha will. I needed the raw, vital force that stabilized my power. I reached out through the tether, sending him a silent plea, a metaphysical tug. Feed me. Stand. In the high tower, miles away, I felt his response. A massive, roaring surge of protectiveness, of raw, resonant power that felt like liquid fire pouring down the connection. He was engaging with Marcus's upper echelon. The conflict was fueling him, and he was siphoning that energy to me. I drew on it greedily. I felt my magic revitalize, not the hot fire, but the cold, deep, empathic connectivity of a highborn agent. I stepped out from the shadows onto the distribution platform. I didn't cast a glamour. I needed them to see me. I needed them to recognize the Fey agent they knew as Damien's property. I looked out over the vast, caged multitude. I extended my hands, palms upward, and I dropped the final defense. I didn't project intent yet. I opened my mind to their collective subconscious. The impact was a brutal, overwhelming tidal wave. Through the amplifier of my bond with the Alpha, I experienced the raw, unfiltered echo of thousands of people in agonizing, prolonged suffering. It was a crushing, dark ocean of starvation, disease, rape, humiliation, and the absolute, petrifying belief in their own worthlessness. I almost collapsed. My nose started to bleed, the coppery scent mixing with the decay of the room. Through the tether, Damien felt my sudden, agonizing spike of pain. I felt his presence in the high tower falter, his protective panic radiating. "Hold!" I commanded him, channeling the last of my agent will into the order. "Stand, the battery is engaged." I drew on his power, using his brutal warrior vitality to construct a cold, psychic bridge. I anchored my own identity, the summer court spy, the woman who had felt mutual healing with the true leader, against the torrent of their despair. I didn't just connect with them, I merged with them. "I know your pain," I projected, the suggestion written not in words, but in pure, empathic resonance, amplified 1,000-fold. "I have felt the cold chains. I have smelled the blood on the granite. I am your conduit." The low murmur of the barracks died, 1,000 heads lifted simultaneously. In Book 1, they would have recoiled in terror, but tonight they felt something new. They felt their own misery validated. They felt a connection. They were a single entity now, a vast, simmering sea of waiting intent. The psychic infrastructure of their conditioning was cracked. I looked out at them, the exhaustion threatening to dissolve me, reliant entirely on the thrumming, constant feed of life from Damien. The high-tension stealth was over. The strategy was in motion. "Wait for the true Alpha," I whispered, the suggestion settling over the silent, caged thousand, like a heavy, cool mist. The battery was engaged. The powder keg was armed, and far above us I felt Damien, my anchor, my partner, the warrior who loved me enough to let me do this, reaching the zenith of his climb, ready to deliver the spark.
The climb to the high tower was a visceral assault. In Book 1, these stairs were a familiar echolocation-based ascent. Now, with eyes wide open, they were a jarring landscape of opulence built on blood. I saw the gold leaf chipping away to reveal brutalist iron, the tapestries woven from stolen human silk, the coppery scent of old violence that permeated the very stone. Through the symbiotic tether, I felt Irene receding into the abyss of the sinks. A knot of cold, predatory anxiety twisted in my gut. The dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the broken weapon. I was the strategist, the alpha, and she was my most vital asset and my most terrifying vulnerability. I felt her reach the bottom. I felt her connect. A tsunami of sheer, paralyzing despair almost buckled my knees. Thousands of broken souls, their misery amplified by her high-born empathy, poured across the link. I felt her sputter, her core identity starting to dissolve under the tidal wave of their hopelessness. "Hold," I commanded, siphoning the raw kinetic energy of my ascent, bleeding my own vitality down the connection. I couldn't go to her physically, so I poured my will into her. Stand. I am the anchor. I reached the massive oak and iron doors of the council chamber. The muffled roar of debate from within ceased the moment my hand touched the brass handle. They knew I was here. Marcus, fueled by elitist paranoia, had surely tracked my progress through the remaining enforcers. I threw the doors open. The council chamber was a grotesque circus of elite privilege. 12 wolves, the pillars of the Stone River Pack's diseased power structure, sat around a semicircular granite table. Behind them stood a dozen elite enforcers, large, brutal beasts whose conditioning warred with the primal terror rolling off them. And in the center on the elevated dais sat Marcus. He wore a velvet robe, the deep crimson of arterial spray. To my blind memory, he was a giant of authority. To my newly opened eyes, he was small. A thin, balding wolf with thinning gray hair, a pinched face of calculating cruelty, and eyes that were dilated with absolute petrifying terror. Beside him stood Celine, her platinum braids tight against her head, her face a mask of venomous narcissistic shock. "Damien," Marcus rasped, his voice lacking its usual resonant boom. He clutched the arms of his granite throne, his scarred knuckles white. You are a mistake that refuses to be corrected. I am the truth you tried to bury, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping into a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated the heavy drapery. I walked into the center of the room, unhurried, unchallenged. The enforcers recoiled, their brute instinct screaming that the true alpha had arrived. "I see you. Finally." Through the tether, I felt Irene stabilize in the dark miles below. The tide of despair had paused. She was holding, drawing greedily on the strength I was projecting. Her safety was binary. I had to shatter this room or she would die in the dark. "Traitor!" Celine shrieked, her voice cracking. "He's a monster! Kill him! What are you waiting for, you useless whelps?" She gestured frantically at the guards. The enforcers hesitated, conditioned to obey her but paralyzed by my presence. "They're waiting for leadership, Celine," I said, looking directly at the captain of the guard. I didn't attack. I simply stood. Through the amplified pack link, the primal capability Irene had unlocked, I didn't just smell their fear. I projected my will onto it. I made them feel the hierarchy. I made them feel the true alpha. The captain's eyes widened, the predatory intelligence vanishing, replaced by total submissive acknowledgement. He lowered his battle axe. "Guards!" Marcus screamed, his voice rising to a panic-stricken squeal. He scrambled up onto the seat of his throne, looking like a cornered rat. "Kill him! I command you! I am the order! I am the pack!" I didn't run. I simply took a breath and let the wolf and the man fully merge. The tactical clarity of Book 2 combined with the raw violence of Book 1. Sight gave me precision and rage gave me power. I shifted. It was not the painful brute force change of my youth. It was an explosive release of kinetic energy. The black tunic tore away. My bones snapped and elongated, muscles ripping and reconfiguring in milliseconds. The black fur erupted. I didn't howl in the dark anymore. I stood on two legs, a massive, scarred, black bipedal werewolf, and looked at them. The confrontation was over. The slaughter began. I didn't need echolocation to find them. I saw the rhythm of their fear. The first three enforcers, loyal to Marcus's direct payroll, lunged. They were big, but I was the true alpha, fueled by a symbiotic connection to highborn magic. I caught the first wolf by the throat, his shift only half complete. I didn't exert pressure. I channeled my alpha will through my touch, a psychic shockwave that shattered his central nervous system. He collapsed instantly, defeated without a mark. The second I grabbed by the jaw and the ruff, I saw the structural weakness in his neck. I twisted, and the wet crunch of his cervical vertebrae imploding echoed through the silent chamber. The third wolf, terrified by the silent efficiency of my violence, tried to turn and run. I backhanded him, my claws fully extended. The force of the blow sent him spinning across the polished stone floor, leaving a smear of dark blood that I could now appreciate with agonizing clarity. I looked at the council members. They were scrambling over each other, a chaotic mass, expensive fabric, and screaming cowardice. I focused on Marcus. He had retreated to the very back of the dais, pressing himself against the cold stone wall, a high-pitched mewling whimper escaping his throat. Celine was gone, having slipped into a side passage. I let her go. The head of the snake was my target. I walked up the dais. I shifted back to human form, raw and exposed, but absolute. Through the tether, the feedback loop was a blazing, screaming cable of shared dependency. Irene was holding the powder keg, relying entirely on the shockwave I was about to deliver. I stood over Marcus. The warrior didn't need to kill him. The alpha needed to dismantle him. "You built this kingdom on lies, Marcus," I said, my voice a quiet, terrifying rumble. I reached down and grabbed the front of his crimson velvet robe, hoisting him up until his feet dangled. "You told them I was a blind, defective monster that only you could control. You told them that the humans needed the chains or they would destroy us. You told them you were the alpha." I shook him hard. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every surviving council member and the submissive enforcers. "I am the true alpha," I commanded, projecting the truth through the pack link with absolute certainty. I siphoned vitality from the air from the very stone and pushed it through the tether to Irene. She needed fuel. The climax was seconds away. "You," I said to Marcus, looking into his rolling, dilated eyes, "you are not a wolf, you are a leech. You hide behind council law while the rest of us bleed." I dropped him. He fell in a heap at the base of his granite throne, weeping and hyperventilating. Through the link I felt Irene, the spider agent, the empathy mage, the woman who loved me enough to let me do this. Reaching the zenith of her connection, the Sinks were armed. "Listen to your true master," she shouted, her voice amplified 1,000-fold by her magic, rolling through the estate like thunder. Marcus looked up at me, his face a mask of primal, screaming terror. He tried to scramble away, but I pinned him with a single massive hand to his chest. I took a deep breath, maximizing my oxygen intake, fully engaging the true alpha within. I didn't need to howl in distress. I needed to deliver a command. I siphoned every ounce of vitality I could draw, every memory of sight, every ember of rage. And I channeled it not at Marcus, but through my own voice and the pack link simultaneously. I amplified the roar with Irene's magic. It was a physical shockwave that blew out the remaining stained glass windows, that shattered the heavy drapery, that dropped every wolf in the grand hall below to their knees in paralyzed, whimpering submission. It was a simple, undeniable, all-encompassing psychic command that rolled through the stone of the estate, into the abyss of the Sinks, and into the minds of thousands of people who had been waiting for generations for a spark. I delivered the command of freedom. "You are free, go home."
The air in the Sinks was not just heavy, it was a physical weight, thick with the oily smell of unwashed bodies, ancient rust, and the sharp, coppery tang of old blood. It clung to the back of my throat, a constant reminder of the misery I was swimming in. I was immersed. I had dropped the final strategic defense and fully opened myself up as a satellite receiver for their collective subconscious. The impact was a tidal wave of sheer, paralyzing despair. Thousands of broken souls, conditioned through generations of brutality to obey, poured their hopelessness across the link. I felt their visceral terror of the council, their starving desperation, their agonizing belief in their own insignificance. It was a crushing, dark ocean that threatened to swamp my own identity. I almost collapsed. Through the intensified high-tension bond, I felt Damien, my anchor, my partner, the warrior who loved me enough to let me do this, falter in his high tower ascent. I felt his protective panic radiate through the tether. Hold, I commanded, not through speech, but through the deep, ancient imperative of our shared soul. Stand, the battery is engaged. I needed him. I needed his alpha will. I needed the restorative, raw, vital life force that stabilized my magic. Proximity had sustained me, but this was a total drain. Far above, I felt him engage with Marcus. The conflict fueled him, and he siphoned that kinetic energy to me. It was a visceral, bleeding exchange of life force. He was pouring his own vitality into me to keep my core identity from dissolving under the weight of the despair below. I drew on it greedily. I used his brute, warrior strength to construct a cold, psychic bridge. I stepped out onto the distribution platform, a raised iron grate over a waste channel. I didn't cast a glamour. I needed them to see me. I needed them to recognize the Fey agent they knew as Damien's property. I extended my hands, palms upward. I extended my identity, merging with the misery. I know your pain, I projected. Written not in words, but in pure, empathic resonance, amplified 1,000-fold by the bond. I have felt the cold chains. I have smelled the blood on the granite. I am your conduit. The low murmur of the Sphinx died. Thousands of heads lifted simultaneously. A sea of tired, terrified eyes focused on me. They felt their own misery validated. They felt a connection. Above us, the castle began to vibrate. I felt the physical echo through the stone floor and the emotional resonance through the amplified pack link. The Grand Hall guards were in panic. The council was screaming. The chaos above was fueling the chaos below. The human guards in the Sphinx, brutalized by their proximity to the wolves, were already losing control. They were shouting, their whips cracking against the iron cages in a frenzied, futile attempt to restore a hierarchy that was already dissolving. The slaves sensed the shift. They looked at the guards, no longer with pure terror, but with a dawning symbiotic aggression. They were waiting. The powder keg was armed. The moment arrived. Miles above, Damien delivered the psychological killing blow. I felt the physical shift as he assumed full control of his true alpha potential. Sighted. Absolute. He gripped the symbiotic tether, siphoning the vital force I was using to maintain the connection, and pushed it back toward me, not as fuel, but as a lens. Now, he commanded. I took a deep, steadying breath, maximizing my oxygen intake, fully engaging my agent focus. I drew on the ancient power of my highborn lineage, not the fire this time, but the deep connectivity. I siphoned his raw will, his warrior strength, and I pushed it outward. I opened the empathic merge to full capacity. I didn't project command yet. I projected the truth of the situation. I made them feel the council's fear. I made them feel their owner's cowardice. I extended my presence over the entire Sphinx. And then I shouted, my voice a quiet, terrifying resonance that was amplified 1,000-fold by the high-tension, intricate bond we shared. Listen to your true master! Through the tether, I felt Damien fully commit. He didn't just howl. He projected an absolute command through the amplified pack link, the primal capability I had unlocked. I felt it coming, a psychic tsunami of pure alpha will, fueled by generations of buried power and amplified by highborn Fey magic. I didn't try to direct it. I became its conduit. I braced myself against the distribution platform, relying entirely on the stabilizing, cold core of Damien's logic to filter the feedback. The connection bled me dry, but I held the structure. The command hit. It was a physical shockwave that rolled through the stone of the Sphinx, into the cages, into the minds of thousands of people who had been conditioned to believe that the stone was the world and the whip was God. It was a simple, undeniable, all-encompassing psychic command that broke generations of conditioning in microseconds. You are free. Go home. The silence in the Sphinx was profound. The murmur of despair, the cracking of whips, the weeping of children, it all stopped. The human guards dropped their weapons, their eyes wide with a terror that surpassed any dynamic they understood. And then, the Sphinx roared. It was not a moan. It was a deep, guttural sound of kinetic energy. The chains rattled as one entity. The cage doors, previously absolute, were warped by a collective, undeniable will. The liberation had begun. The roar was not just a sound. It was a physical cataclysm that turned my very bones to glass. When Damien's amplified will tore through the psychic infrastructure of the Sphinx, the backlash slammed into me with the force of a high-speed collision. The symbiotic tether, previously a blaring cable of vital force, sputtered. I felt my core identity dissolve, my consciousness fragmenting into the thousands of individual streams of dawning, terrifying liberty I was channeling. My vision went gray, the edges dissolving into static. My nose bled freely now, coppery warmth spilling over my lips. mixing with the sweat and grime. I collapsed against the rusty railing of the distribution platform, reliant entirely on the thin, vibrating thread of Damien's distant logic to keep from sliding into total, empathic oblivion. Below me, hell had broken its chains. The psychic blast that had broken the human's conditioning had simultaneously stunned the remaining wolf guards. Through the connection, I felt their predatory minds go quiet, neutralized by a command that supersedes species. They were paralyzed. The humans were not. The silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then the Sphinx erupted in a single, guttural sound of kinetic energy. It was not a moan. It was a roar that rivaled the alphas. The cage doors, previously absolute, were warped by the collective, undeniable pressure of thousands of bodies that had forgotten how to fear. I watched, static flickering across my vision, as the guards were swept away. It was not a battle. It was a liquidation. The Sphinx turned into a crushing tide of liberation that flowed toward the upper exits, trampling any wolf or human overseer that stood in its path. Damien, I projected, a silent, desperate prayer sent up the tether. Anchor, stand. He responded. His logic was cold, precise, and absolute. I felt him stabilize miles above me. He was drawing siphoned vitality from the very air of the council chambers and pouring it down the line. It hit me like a splash of glacial water, shocking my fragmented consciousness back into cohesion. I pushed myself off the railing. I couldn't stand without his support, but I couldn't stay here. The sinks were empty, the cage doors hanging open like broken jaws, the air still thick with the humidity of raw, explosive liberty. I began the ascent. It was a pilgrimage of exhaustion. My legs were heavy, my lungs burned, and every step required a conscious act of strategy. I had to merge with his strength to move. We were no longer two agents performing a tactical maneuver. We were one entity sharing a single, battered life force. I found him in the council chambers. The heavy oak and iron doors were splintered. The massive granite table was cracked. The tapestries were in tatters. The stained glass windows were gone. Damien stood over the broken body of Marcus, who lay in a heap at the base of his granite throne, weeping and hyperventilating. Damien was back in human form, raw and exposed, but absolute. He catalogued my exhausted state, his concern a physical ache in the link, but he didn't move to help me. He knew I needed to do this on my own. I walked to Marcus. I looked down at the man who had ordered my family's massacre, who had bound me as a poisoned chalice to crush the true alpha. He looked small, a thin, balding wolf with eyes dilated with absolute, petrifying terror. He looked at me, and through the intensified symbiotic bond, I didn't just see his fear, I felt the cold arithmetic of his cowardice. He wasn't afraid of death, he was afraid of insignificance. "You built this kingdom on lies, Marcus," I said, my voice a quiet, terrifying resonance, amplified by the connection. "You told them I was a blind, defective monster. You told them the humans needed the chains. You told them you were the alpha." I reached out and lightly touched his scarred shoulder. I didn't exert force. I simply allowed him to feel the depth of my empathy merge. I let him feel the collective misery of the thousands of people he had systematically crushed, amplified by my phase sensitivity and anchored by Damien's brutal vitality. Marcus shrieked, a thin, dynamic sound that cracked through the silent room. He scrambled away from my touch, pressing himself against the cold stone of his throne, clawing at his own face as the feedback loop almost dissolved his sanity. I turned away from him. He was broken. The strategy didn't require his death, it required his ruin. I looked at Damien. Through my newly revitalized perception, his gaze, those dark, piercing eyes, was a physical weight. The internal conflict was over. He was no longer the broken weapon, and I was no longer the spy. We were equals in a devastating symbiosis. We left the chambers. The castle above us was a battlefield of raw intent. The psychic shockwave that had stunned the wolves below had energized the humans in the upper levels. The estate was in total chaos as thousands of slaves trampled the gates and fled into the night. We made our way to the battlements. The sky was the deep, velvety indigo of pre-dawn. Below us, the estate was a wrecked, silent husk. The slaves were gone, the outer ring was in ashes, and the remaining wolves of the Stone River Pack were hiding in the shadows, their hierarchy shattered, their leadership broken. We were left with a profound silence. We had created a power vacuum, a destroyed home, and the looming threat of the summer court coming to investigate my actions. We were exhausted, our bodies marked by violence, our minds scarred by the forced dependency. But we were powerful, and we were free. Damien stood beside me. Sight had not made him soft, it had made him lethal, on a frequency that this world did not comprehend. He looked out at the horizon, cataloging the strange new landscape with obsessive, terrified wonder. He reached out and took my hand. His grip was immense, powered by his newly claimed alpha will, but gentle. The physical contact was not clinical anymore. It was restorative, a reclaiming of bodies that he had forged a bond beyond strategic alliance. We worshipped each other with this intense connection. Through the link, I felt his focus, a cold, calculated determination that replacing his usual hot fury. He was looking at the future, and for the first time in 20 years, the horizon was finally clear. I looked out at the dawn breaking over the ruined estate, holding the hand of the warrior who loved me enough to let me destroy it. New dawn, I projected, written not in words, but in pure, empathic resolution. Together, he replied. 6 months had passed since the night the Stone River pack fell, the night the sky burned and the earth roared with the sound of thousands reclaiming their souls. We had left the brutalist carcass of the estate to the scavengers in the shadows, moving west toward the jagged peaks of the Frostfeather Range. Here, in a high, secluded valley, where the pine trees grew ancient and thick, we were building something new. It was not a fortress. It was a settlement constructed from timber and riverstone, designed with an openness that still made some of the older, surviving wolves twitchy with instinctual vulnerability. But the humans who had chosen to stay with us, the few who had nowhere else to go, or perhaps who saw the same dawning light in Damien that I did, moved through the spaces with a tentative growing confidence. I stood on the wrapping porch of our cabin, nursing a cup of pine needle tea. The valley was currently bathed in the soft, bruised purple light of pre-dawn. Below the settlement slept, the only sounds the rushing of the glacial melt river and the distant rhythmic chop of wood. My physical form had healed. The scars from Celine's silver daggers were faint, silvery tracks against my dark skin, matching the deep claw marks on Damien's broad shoulders. My fey core, once drained to a sputtering ember, was slowly, meticulously replenishing itself. The green light no longer exploded when I was angry. It hummed within me, a steady, calm current of vital force that was inextricably woven into the symbiotic bond. I was not the agent anymore. I was not the spider, nor the poison chalice. I was the stabilizing heart of this fragile new reality. Through the intensified, permanent connection we shared, I felt Damien return before I saw him. His proximity was a sudden, physical warmth, a vibration in the air that was unique to his frequency. He walked out of the tree line, a heavy bundle of firewood slung over his shoulder. He wore only simple trousers, his bare chest slick with sweat from the pre-dawn exertion. To my fully restored, empathic vision, he was a blinding, dynamic entity. Sight had not simplified his warrior structure, it had refined it with a terrifying precision. The tactical brute from Book 1 had fully merged with the calculated strategist of Book 2. But now, filtered through the light I had given him, and the love that anchored him, there was a new architecture to his strength. It was protective, purposeful, and infinitely patient. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me. Those dark, piercing eyes, the eyes that Marcus had tried to extinguish with high-born plague, now catalogued me with a meticulous, adoring reverence. He didn't just smell my physical health or register my warmth through echolocation. He saw me. He saw the shift in my posture, the texture of my hair, the specific shade of green in the aura that still bled across the link. I saw the memory of the struggle in his gaze, the violence of Miller's Creek, the darkness of his youth, the agonizing dependency of our winter together. But those shadows were no longer the structure. They were the contrast that defined the light. "Good morning, Agent," he rummaged, a slight, rare smile ghosting on his lips. He used the old operational term as an act of affection, reclaiming the past. "You're tracking in mud, True Alpha," I replied, the gentle dynamic of our shared humor a testament to the peace we had fought to secure. He walked up the steps, dropping the wood. He moved with a devastating efficiency, closing the distance between us until his heat was a blanket and his presence was absolute. He didn't just stand near me, he enveloped me. He reached out and took my hand. His grip was immense, powered by his newly claimed alpha will, but gentle. The physical contact was not clinical, not a strategy to siphon energy. It was worship. We merged not through desperate need, but through shared, vibrant capacity. Through the link, I felt his focus. He was looking at the future, and for the first time in 20 years, the horizon was not defined by rage or fear, but by possibility. Beautiful, I projected up the tether, channeling the visceral sense of peace the valley offered, the light, the smell of pine, and the absolute certainty of his love. Together, he replied, written not in words, but in pure, unwavering resolution. He didn't just look at the dawn breaking over the mountain peaks. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the true architecture of light. It was not a magical burst or a strategic solution. It was a fragile, complex thing that we had built together, brick by bruised brick, defined not by the darkness we had escaped, but by the relentless, beautiful will to find the light and to hold it. We were equals in a devastating symbiosis. We were free, and we were home.
The sky is falling, the ground shakes. We're standing still as the world breaks. I see the fear inside your eyes, but I won't let this be goodbye. If this is the end, just stay with me. One last kiss, that's all we'll need. Hold me until the war ends. Don't let go, don't pretend. If the world burns down tonight, I'll still be yours in the fading light. Hold me. Hold me until the war ends. The air is heavy, the night's cold, but in your arms I'm still whole. I don't know what tomorrow brings, but here and now we have everything. If we survive, if we fall, promise me you'll remember it all.